Cole Mercer put his fist through the porch post the night he read his father's will, and he was still bleeding when the lawyer told him the wound wouldn't be the last thing that broke him that year. "You marry the Brooks girl by the 1st of August, the old man said, "or Silver Creek goes to the bank." Cole looked at the paper in his hand and understood for the first time in his life that his father had sold his future from beyond the grave. Before we start, if stories like this pull at your heart, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end. Drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The letter had come 3 weeks earlier, and Cole had not slept right since. He'd read it standing in the barn doorway with the smell of hay and horse sweat thick around him, and by the second line, his hands had gone cold. Silver Creek Ranch is bound under the terms of your late father's contract with Ezra Brooks of Chicago to the marriage of Cole Anderson Mercer to Hannah Elizabeth Brooks, to be solemnized no later than August 1st, 1892. Failure to complete this union voids the loan extension and forfeits the property to First Montana Trust. He had read it 4 times before he believed it, and even then, he hadn't believed it so much as surrendered to it. His father, dead 8 months, had made a deal with a Chicago merchant to save the ranch, and the price was Cole's whole life, signed away before Cole had ever laid eyes on the woman he was meant to marry. "You knew about this," Cole said to Otis Pruitt, the family lawyer, when the man rode out to Silver Creek to confirm the date. "I drew up the papers myself," Otis said. "Your father didn't want you fighting him on it while he was still breathing. Figured you'd fight him harder from the grave, and he was right, wasn't he? I don't even know her. You'll know her soon enough. Train gets in Saturday." Cole set his jaw and looked out past the corrals to the hills that had belonged to Mercer men for 3 generations, hills that would belong to a bank by winter if he didn't do exactly what his dead father wanted. "What's she like?" Otis hesitated, and that hesitation told Cole more than any answer could have. "Can't say I've met her personally, but I've heard talk." "What talk?" "Best you see for yourself, son." That was Wednesday. By Thursday, half the county had heard, because in a town the size of Cedar Hollow, no secret survived a full week, and Cole's engagement was too rich a piece of gossip to keep quiet. He rode into town for supplies and felt the stairs before he even dismounted. "Heard congratulations are in order, Mercer," called Hollis Pratt from the steps of the Mercantile, grinning wide enough to show the gap in his teeth. "Chicago bride. Fancy. Get your supplies elsewhere if you've got nothing better to do than gossip, Hollis." "Ain't gossip if it's true. Whole town's talking about who them Brooks folks are sending you." Hollis leaned against the post, enjoying himself. "My cousin does laundry for the Ashford place, and Mrs. Ashford's sister lives 2 doors down from the Brooks family back in Chicago. Word is, the girl they're sending you is the daughter nobody wanted." Cole's stomach tightened, but he kept his face still. "Meaning what?" "Meaning she's near 30 and never had a suitor worth the name. Meaning she's heavy enough that polite society wouldn't have her at a single dance. Her own family's shipping her out here to get rid of her and dressing it up as charity to save your ranch." Hollis shook his head with mock sympathy. "Old man Mercer made himself a hard bargain, Cole. Poor land, poor bride." Cole's hand closed hard around the strap of his saddlebag. "You don't know a thing about her." "Neither do you. That's my point." Hollis pushed off the post and ambled toward the saloon, calling back over his shoulder. "Reckon you'll find out Saturday same as the rest of us. Whole town's fixing to be at the depot to see the wrong Brooks daughter step off that train." Cole didn't answer him. He loaded his supplies and rode home with his jaw aching from how hard he'd been clenching it, and that night he sat at his father's old desk with the ranch ledgers spread in front of him, doing the arithmetic he already knew by heart. $2,000 owed to First Montana Trust. Cattle prices down. A herd thinned by a hard winter. A ranch hand's wages 3 weeks late. And now in 11 days, a wife he'd never met arriving under a cloud of cruelty that had reached him before she had. He thought about writing to Helena and telling the bank to take the land. He thought about it seriously, turning the idea over while the lamp burned low. And then he thought about his father's hands, cracked and sun-browned, laying fence line before dawn for 30 years, and he thought about the graves out past the north pasture, 3 generations of Mercers who'd bled for this dirt. I'm not losing it, he said out loud to no one. Not to a bank, and not to what folks in town think of a woman I ain't even met. He didn't sleep well after that either, but at least he slept knowing what he intended to do. The days between passed slow and mean. Every trip to town brought a fresh insult dressed up as friendly conversation. Mildred Cotter, who ran the boarding house, stopped him outside the church to tell him she'd pray for him. Marriage is hard enough, Cole, without starting it off unequal, she said, patting his arm like he was already a widower. Some women just aren't built for ranch life. It's a kindness to know your limits. She hasn't even arrived yet, Mrs. Cotter. No, but I've heard she'll need 2 men to help her down from the train car. Mildred's smile didn't reach her eyes. I don't say it to be cruel, dear. I say it because somebody ought to warn you. Cole touched his hat and walked away before he said something he'd regret to a woman twice his age. But the warnings kept coming from the barber, from the men at the feed store, from the schoolteacher who caught him on the road and offered her sympathies like he'd already buried something. By Friday night, he was so tired of hearing about his bride that he almost dreaded the sight of her more than he dreaded losing the ranch. Almost. Saturday morning, Cole put on his one good shirt, saddled his horse, and rode into Cedar Hollow to meet a woman the entire county had already convicted of being a burden before she'd said a single word. The depot platform was crowded by the time he got there, which told him everything he needed to know about how the town felt about minding its own business. Half of Cedar Hollow had turned out to watch. Farmers, ranch hands, the preacher's wife, even old Judge Halloway, who never left his porch for anything short of a hanging. There he is, someone murmured. Poor Mercer boy. Cole ignored it and walked to the edge of the platform, boots loud against the boards, and stood with his hat in his hands, like a man waiting on sentencing. The whistle sounded a quarter-mile out, and the crowd's murmuring picked up, sharpened, turned eager the way people get when they're waiting to watch something humiliating happen to somebody else. Reckon they'll need a ramp, Hollis Pratt said from somewhere behind him, and a ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Cole's hands curled into fists at his sides, and he didn't turn around, because turning around would mean showing them how much it cost him to stand there and take it. The train groaned into the station brakes, screaming steam, rolling out across the platform, and for a moment, nobody could see anything at all. Then the steam cleared. A woman stepped down from the passenger car, one hand on the rail, the other holding a single worn leather suitcase, and she moved like a person who had made her peace with being watched a long time ago. She wasn't what Cole expected, though he couldn't have said exactly what he'd expected, not after 2 weeks of the whole county trying to build a monster in his mind. She was solid through the shoulders and hips. A big woman in a plain brown traveling dress with her dark hair pinned neat under a simple straw hat, and her face when she lifted it and scanned the platform was calm, in a way that didn't match the crowd's hungry silence at all. Somebody snickered. Somebody else whispered loud enough to carry, "Lord, they weren't exaggerating." The woman's eyes found the sound held on it for a second, and then moved on unhurried, like she'd decided the comment wasn't worth the trouble of reacting to. She scanned the platform once more and stopped when she found Cole standing apart from the crowd with his hat in his hands. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice was steadier than his had been in 2 weeks. "Yes, ma'am." He stepped forward, and every eye on that platform followed him. Cole Mercer. Hannah Brooks. She didn't offer her hand for him to kiss or curtsy the way Chicago women were supposed to, according to every dime novel Cole had ever half-read. She just looked at him direct and unblinking, taking his measure the same way he was taking hers. "I apologize for the delay. The train was held up outside Billings." No apology needed. Behind him, the crowd had gone quiet, in the particular way crowds go quiet when they're deciding whether the show is over or just getting started. Hannah's gaze flicked past Cole's shoulder, taking in the assembled town, and something in her face tightened for just a moment before it smoothed back out. "They came to see the bride your father bought you," she said low enough that only Cole could hear. "I take it I'm not what they were promised." Cole didn't know how to answer that, so he told her the truth. "They were promised somebody to laugh at. I don't reckon it matters much what you actually look like." Something flickered across her face, quick as a struck match gone before he could name it. "That's an honest answer, Mr. Mercer. I didn't expect one so soon." "Cole, reckon we're past Mr. and Miss given the circumstances. Cole, then." She adjusted her grip on the suitcase, and Cole noticed for the first time that she'd traveled 2,000 miles with a single bag. No trunk, no trailing maid, nothing but what she could carry herself. "And I'm Hannah, not the Brooks girl, not whatever else I heard whispered on my way off that train." "You heard that. I hear most things people say when they think a fat woman can't understand plain English." Her tone stayed even, almost pleasant, but there was steel under it, the kind that didn't need raising a voice to make its point. "I've been hearing it since I was 12 years old. I've gotten quite good at hearing it and not letting it slow me down." Cole looked at her for a long moment, and behind him he heard Hollis Pratt mutter something to his neighbor, followed by another ripple of laughter, and Cole felt something shift in his chest. Something he didn't have a name for yet. Something that made him turn around and face the crowd directly for the first time since the train pulled in. "Show's over," he said loud enough to carry across the platform. "Any of you got business at the depot, go on and tend to it. Rest of you can go home." Nobody moved right away. Hollis, emboldened by an audience, called out, "Just came to welcome your bride, Cole. No harm in that." "There's harm in it when you're standing there laughing at a woman who hasn't done a single thing to any of you." Cole's voice carried an edge none of them had heard from him before, not even when his father died. "She rode 2 days on a train to get here. Longest thing any of you did today was walk from the saloon." The crowd shifted uncomfortable now. The fun draining out of the moment, the way it does when the person being mocked stops playing along and somebody else stands up for them instead. Mildred Cotter had the decency to look embarrassed. Hollis just shrugged and turned away, muttering something about touchy grooms. Hannah watched the crowd disperse with an expression Cole couldn't quite read. Something between surprise and calculation, like she was recalculating a sum that hadn't added up the way she'd expected. "You didn't have to do that," she said once the platform had mostly cleared. "Didn't do it for you. Did it because it was right." Cole picked up her suitcase before she could object, surprised at how light it was for someone traveling clear across the country to start a new life. "This everything. That's everything. No trunk coming later? No more baggage. I packed what mattered." Hannah fell into step beside him as he headed for the horses, and Cole noticed she moved easy, unhurried, no sign of the frailty half the county had predicted for her. "Ledgers weigh more than dresses, Mr. Mercer. I brought 3 years of bookkeeping training and left the rest behind." Cole stopped walking. "Ledgers. My father owned a shipping concern in Chicago. Had no sons, so he taught me the business instead of pretending I didn't have a head for numbers." She said it plainly, no defensiveness in it, like she was stating the weather. "I understand you're behind on a loan to First Montana Trust." The name landed like a slap. "How do you know that?" "Because my father doesn't send money into a marriage contract without knowing exactly what he's buying into, and he told me everything before I got on that train." Hannah met his eyes without flinching. "I know about the $2,000. I know about the herd losses last winter. I know you're 11 days from a payment you can't make without help." Cole stood in the middle of the depot platform, hat still in his hand, feeling like the ground had shifted under him twice in one morning. "Nobody in this town knows half of that, and you've been here 20 minutes. The town's too busy talking about my waistline to ask about your finances." A corner of her mouth lifted not quite a smile, but close to one. "That works in our favor if you're willing to let it." "Our favor? You married a stranger to save a ranch, Cole. I came 2,000 miles knowing exactly what I was walking into, and I didn't pack 4 dresses and a hope chest. I packed a business mine my whole family thought was wasted on a daughter." She looked toward the horses, waiting at the hitching post, then back at him. "So no, I don't intend to sit in your kitchen sewing while your ranch goes under. I intend to look at your books tonight if you'll let me." Cole didn't answer right away. Everything in him wanted to say something sharp, something about how she didn't know him, didn't know the land, didn't know the first thing about running cattle in Montana. But he thought about the ledgers on his father's desk. The numbers that didn't move, no matter how many hours he put in, fixing fence, and doctoring sick stock. And he thought about how every person in that crowd had been so certain she'd be useless that not one of them had bothered to ask what she actually was. "Tonight," he said. "After supper." "After supper," she agreed and let him help her up onto the second horse. And if his hands lingered a beat longer than necessary, steadying her into the saddle, neither of them mentioned it. They rode out of Cedar Hollow, with the whole town watching from windows and doorways, and Cole caught pieces of the muttering as they passed. Somebody called out something about hoping the horse could bear the weight. Somebody else laughed. Hannah's spine stayed straight the entire ride out, and she didn't once look back at the town that had already decided who she was before she'd said a word to any of them. "They'll keep talking," Cole said, when they'd put enough distance between themselves and Cedar Hollow that the buildings had shrunk small behind them. "They've been talking about me my whole life. I stopped waiting for them to stop." Hannah's hands were steady on the reins, competent, like she'd ridden before, which surprised him. "What matters is whether you're going to keep listening to them, or whether you're going to let me see those ledgers." I said I would. Saying and meaning aren't always the same thing in my experience. She glanced sideways at him. "Your father made a business arrangement, Cole. I intend to honor my half of it properly. Question is whether you intend to honor yours, or whether you're going to spend the next year treating me like the joke the whole town's decided I am." Cole thought about Hollis Pratt's laughter, about Mildred Cotter's pity, about the way the crowd had gone quiet and ugly the moment the train doors opened, and he thought about how none of them, not one, had asked Hannah Brooks a single question before deciding what she was worth. "I don't know you," he said, "but I know what it's like to have folks decide what you are before you've had a chance to show them different. My father spent 30 years proving this land was worth something, and half this county still calls Silver Creek a lost cause." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Reckon I can give you the same chance I'd want given to me. Show me what you can do. I'll judge you on that, not on what Hollis Pratt thinks of your waistline." Hannah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful evenness. "That's the first decent thing anyone in this state has said to me since I stepped off the train in Billings. Doesn't mean I trust you yet. I wouldn't ask you to. Trust gets earned. I intend to earn mine with numbers, not sentiment." She looked out at the land unrolling ahead of them, wide and sun-scorched and empty of anyone else's opinion for the first time all day. "Now tell me about this loan while we ride so I'm not walking into your ledgers blind tonight." And so, with the sun climbing high and Cedar Hollow shrinking behind them, Cole Mercer told his new wife about the debt that was going to bury him, and for the first time in 8 months since his father's funeral, he felt something other than the crushing certainty that he was going to lose everything alone. Silver Creek Ranch came into view a little after midday, the house and barn and corrals sitting exactly where they'd sat for 30 years. And Cole watched Hannah's face as she took it in, bracing himself for whatever judgment a Chicago-raised woman might have for a working cattle operation that had seen better days. She didn't say anything about the peeling paint on the house or the sagging corner of the bunkhouse roof. She looked at the cattle scattered across the near pasture, counted them under her breath, and said, "That's fewer than I expected based on what my father's contact told him about the herd size 2 years back. Winter took 30 head. Disease took another dozen the year before that. So the herd's down by roughly a third in 2 years, and you're still carrying debt calculated against the old numbers." Hannah nodded slowly, like a piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. "That explains a great deal about why the payments feel impossible instead of merely difficult." 2 ranch hands were working near the corral, and both of them stopped what they were doing to stare as Cole and Hannah rode in. One of them, a lean older man named Amos Guthrie, who'd worked for Cole's father before Cole was even born, pulled off his hat and wiped his brow, watching Hannah dismount with an expression he didn't bother to hide. "This the missus?" Amos asked, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Hannah Brooks," Cole said. "Hannah, this is Amos. Foreman here longer than I've been alive." "Mr. Guthrie." Hannah offered her hand, and Amos shook it after a pause that lasted just a beat too long, clearly unaccustomed to a woman offering a handshake like a business partner instead of a curtsy like a lady. "Ma'am?" Amos's eyes flicked to Cole, a question in them that he didn't voice out loud, but Cole caught it anyway. The younger hand, a boy of maybe 19 named Ricky, didn't bother hiding his reaction at all. He snorted, turned it into a cough when Cole's eyes cut to him and busied himself with a length of rope. "Something funny, Ricky?" Cole asked. "No, sir." Ricky kept his eyes down, but his shoulders were still shaking with suppressed laughter. Hannah didn't acknowledge it. She was already walking toward the barn, studying the structure with the same assessing look she'd given the cattle. "Your hay stores, are they in here?" "West side?" Cole said, following her, aware of Amos and Ricky watching the two of them with open curiosity now. "I'd like to see them before supper if there's time. And the equipment shed. And I'll want a full accounting of your grazing leases if you have written agreements, or if they're handshake arrangements, because handshake arrangements are usually where money disappears without anyone noticing." "You want to do all that today? I want to understand what I'm working with before I offer opinions I can't back up with facts." Hannah stopped at the barn door and turned to face him fully. "I imagine you thought your wife was going to arrive, unpack a hope chest, and ask you what color to paint the kitchen." "Something like that," Cole admitted. "I'm not that wife. I never intended to be." For just a moment, something vulnerable crossed her face, quick as a shadow gone before he could hold on to it. "I know what this county thinks I am. I know what they'll keep saying no matter what I do. So I've decided the only thing worth spending my energy on is being useful, because usefulness is the one thing they can't laugh away, not once the results are sitting right in front of them." Cole studied her for a long moment, the cruel talk of the last 2 weeks warring in his mind against the woman standing in front of him, steady and unbothered, and already 3 steps ahead of him on a conversation about grazing leases he hadn't even started. "Ledgers are in the house," he said finally. "Figured you'd want to eat something first, but if you'd rather start now..." "Now," Hannah said. "I've been hungry before. I haven't seen your books before, and every hour we spend not looking at them is an hour closer to a payment neither of us can make." They walked to the house together, and behind them, Cole heard Amos mutter something to Ricky low enough that he couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to hear them to know the shape of what was being said. The whole ranch would know within a day that the new wife had skipped her own welcome supper to go straight for the account books, and Cole suspected that by Sunday all of Cedar Hollow would know it too, and turn it into one more thing to laugh about. He found standing on his own porch with a woman he'd known for 3 hours that he didn't much care what they laughed about anymore. Before they reached the porch, a woman came around the side of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, gray-haired and broad-shouldered, with the look of somebody who'd raised 4 sons and buried none of them soft. This was Sarah Guthrie Amos's wife, who'd cooked for Silver Creek longer than Cole had been alive. "So you're her?" Sarah said, studying Hannah frankly, without the cruelty Cole had heard all week in town, but without much warmth either. "Heard plenty about you already. Whole county's been talking since the letter came." "I imagine they have." Hannah met her gaze steady. "I'd rather you judged me on what I do than on what you've heard Mrs. Guthrie, if that's not too much to ask." Sarah's eyebrows lifted a fraction, some calculation moving behind her eyes. "Fair enough. I made a pot roast for tonight, figured a new bride oughtn't start married life on beans and salt pork. It's warming on the stove whenever you two are ready to eat." "Thank you, that was kind." "Wasn't kindness exactly. Was manners." Sarah turned to go, then paused and looked back at Hannah once more. "You held your chin up out there at the depot. Amos told me how it went. Not many would have managed that with half the town lined up to gawk." "I've had practice." Something that might have been the beginning of respect flickered across Sarah's weathered face before she nodded once and disappeared back around the side of the house. And Cole watched Hannah watch her go, and neither of them said anything about it. Though Cole suspected they were both turning the same thought over that one person in Cedar Hollow's orbit at least hadn't decided everything about her before she'd opened her mouth. Inside the house was quiet dust motes hanging in the afternoon light through the front window. And Cole's father's old desk sat where it always had, buried under ledgers and unpaid notices, and the particular chaos of a man who'd been trying to hold a failing operation together with will alone. Cole hadn't touched the desk since the funeral, except to add to the pile. Hannah set her suitcase down by the door, walked straight to the desk and looked at the mess spread across it with an expression that mixed dismay and something like recognition, the look of a person confronting a problem they already half understood. "May I?" she asked, hand hovering over the nearest stack of papers. "Go ahead." She pulled the lamp closer, despite the daylight still coming through the window, and began sorting the papers into piles, with quick practiced hands muttering figures under her breath as she went. Cole stood in the doorway and watched her work, and for the first time since he'd read his father's will, he let himself feel something other than dread. "This grazing lease," Hannah said after nearly 20 minutes of silent sorting, holding up a page and frowning at it. "The one with Whitfield's land, the northern pasture access." "What about it?" "Do you know what percentage of your calf sales you're paying him for that access?" Cole thought about it. 15%, same as always. According to this document, it's 18%, and it renews automatically every year unless you formally cancel it in writing 30 days before the term ends, which I'd guess nobody's ever done because most ranchers don't read the renewal clause on a handshake lease they've had for a decade. Cole crossed the room and looked over her shoulder at the page at the clause she was pointing to buried in dense legal language near the bottom of the second sheet. "That's 3% more than we agreed. That's 3% more than you agreed to a decade ago, when this lease was presumably first signed, and somewhere along the way, either through a renewal you didn't examine closely, or an amendment you didn't notice it crept up to 18. Hannah looked up at him, and there was no triumph in her expression, only a kind of grim clarity. 3% doesn't sound like much, but on your calf sales over the life of this lease, that's likely cost you several $100s you never should have paid. Cole felt something hot and sick turn over in his stomach. "Whitfield's known my family 20 years. Knowing your family 20 years doesn't mean he wouldn't take an extra 3% if the paperwork let him get away with it quietly." Hannah set the page aside and reached for the next one. "I'm not saying he did it maliciously, Cole. I'm saying nobody was watching the numbers closely enough to notice either way, and that's a problem we can fix starting tonight." Cole pulled a chair up beside the desk and sat down. And for the next 2 hours, as the light outside shifted from afternoon gold to evening blue, he watched his new wife take apart every document his father had left behind, finding errors and oversights, and small, quiet thefts that had been bleeding Silver Creek dry for years without anyone noticing because nobody had ever sat down and looked at the whole picture at once. "How do you know all this?" he finally asked somewhere past the second hour when she'd found a third discrepancy in a feed supplier's invoice. Ledger's contract's renewal clauses. That's not something most folks learn unless they've done it professional. "I told you. My father trained me." Hannah didn't look up from the page in front of her. He had 4 daughters and no sons, and rather than pretend that meant his business had to die with him, he decided to teach the daughter who showed an aptitude for numbers, and that daughter turned out to be me. She finally raised her eyes to his. "My sisters got courted and married well, and settled into fine houses in fine neighborhoods. I got taught how to read a balance sheet because nobody was lining up to court the fat daughter, and my father, God rest him, decided I might as well be good for something instead of sitting decoratively in a parlor waiting for a husband who was never going to come." There was no self-pity in the way she said it, just a flat accounting of facts, the same tone she used for reading a bad grazing lease. But Cole heard the old wound underneath it anyway, the years of being told in 100 small ways that she wasn't wanted the way her sisters were wanted. "Their loss," he said, before he'd fully decided to say it. Hannah went still for a moment, pen hovering over the page. "That's a kind thing to say to a woman you married under duress 3 hours ago." "Wasn't trying to be kind, just calling it how I see it." Cole nodded at the papers scattered across the desk. "You found more wrong with this ranch in 2 hours than I found in 8 months of staring at these same books and not understanding why the numbers never added up right. You're not a numbers man. There's no shame in that. You're a cattleman, and from what I can tell from these records, you're a good one. Your herd's health indicators are strong for a ranch that's been through 2 hard years." Hannah set down her pen and looked at him directly. "I'm not here to replace what you're good at, Cole. I'm here to fix what's been quietly draining this ranch while you were busy doing the part you're good at. Bank still wants $2,000 in 11 days. Fixing a bad grazing lease doesn't hand me that kind of money by August 1st. No, it doesn't. Hannah leaned back in the chair, and for the first time since she'd sat down, she looked tired, the day finally catching up to her. But it's a start, and starts matter. Tonight, I've found close to $400 in errors and overcharges going back 3 years. That won't save the ranch by itself. But it tells me something important. What's that? It tells me Silver Creek isn't actually failing because it's a bad ranch, or because your father made bad decisions, or because you're not working hard enough. Hannah's voice had gone quiet, steady, certain. It's failing because nobody's been watching the money as closely as they've been watching the cattle. That's a solvable problem, Cole. That's not fate. That's just neglect, and neglect can be corrected. Cole sat with that for a long moment, the lamp burning low between them, the house quiet around them, except for the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night outside. He thought about 8 months of lying awake, calculating losses. He couldn't explain, certain in his bones, that the ranch was simply cursed, doomed the way half the county already believed it was. "Nobody in Cedar Hollow is going to believe you did this," he said. "They'll say I did the figuring myself, and I'm too proud to admit my wife helped. Let them say whatever keeps them comfortable." Hannah gathered the papers into a neat stack, squaring the edges with quick, efficient movements. "I didn't come here to be believed by Cedar Hollow, Cole. I came here to save a ranch, and if the town needs to invent a story where you did all the work yourself, so they don't have to reconsider what they decided about me on that train platform, I don't much care. The numbers will speak for themselves eventually. They always do." Outside, full dark had fallen, and somewhere near the bunkhouse, Cole could hear Amos and Ricky talking low, probably about the strange new bride who'd spent her wedding night bent over account books, instead of anywhere else a new bride might reasonably be expected to spend it. Cole found to his own surprise that he didn't care about that either. Before either of them moved from the desk, Hannah pulled one more paper from the bottom of the stack, the note from First Montana Trust itself, and went quiet in a way that made Cole's stomach drop. "What?" he said. "This interest rate." She held the paper closer to the lamp, reading it twice like she wanted to be wrong. "Cole, this is calculated at 9%. That's what the bank told my father. 9%, same as every note in the territory. Every note in the territory that I've seen through my father's shipping business runs 6 to 7% for secured land loans, and this loan is secured against the entire ranch." Hannah set the paper down and looked at him. Either Montana banking is genuinely different from Illinois banking, which I doubt given how closely the railroads tie the two together, or somebody at First Montana Trust wrote your father a rate he had no way of comparing against anything, because a grieving rancher with no other bank to ask isn't in a position to negotiate. Cole felt the floor tilt under him a second time that night. "You're saying the bank cheated my father. I'm saying I can't prove that tonight with one document and no other notes to compare it against. But I intend to find out, because 2 extra points of interest on a debt this size is the difference between a payment you can barely make and a payment that's designed to be impossible." Hannah's voice had gone flat and cold, the tone of a woman doing arithmetic on something that made her angry. Banks that want to seize land don't always call in the note outright, Cole. Sometimes it's easier to write the rate high enough that the borrower drowns himself slow and never has cause to accuse anybody of anything. You think Whitmore did that on purpose? The bank president's name came out of Cole's mouth like something bitter. "I think it's worth finding out before we assume it, and I don't intend to walk into that bank making accusations I can't back with paper." Hannah gathered the note carefully and set it apart from the rest in its own small stack. "But I intend to write to my father's associates in Helena this week and ask what a fair rate looks like on a secured ranch loan in this territory. If Silver Creek's been paying 2 points more than it should have for years, that's not bad luck, Cole. That's a debt built to fail on purpose, and men who build debts like that usually have a reason." Cole sat with that for a long moment, anger and something like relief tangled together in his chest, because if the ranch's troubles weren't purely his father's mismanagement or his own hard luck, if some of it had been done to them on purpose, then some of it at least could be undone. Sarah's pot roast had gone from warm to merely edible by the time they finally sat down to eat, and they ate mostly in silence. At first, both of them worn thin from the day, until Hannah set down her fork and looked at him across the table. "Can I ask you something that isn't about ledgers?" "Go ahead. Why didn't you fight it? Your father's contract. You could have let the bank take the ranch and started somewhere new, somewhere nobody knew your family or your debts. Plenty of men would have." Cole turned that over before answering because it deserved a real answer. Not the quick one he usually gave when townsfolk asked him the same question with less kindness in their voices. "My grandfather built the first cabin on this land with his own hands before there was a cedar hollow to speak of. My father's buried out past the north pasture next to my mother, next to a brother I never got to meet who died as a baby. This ranch isn't just dirt and cattle to me. It's every Mercer who ever lived and died trying to make something out of nothing in a hard country." He looked at her steadily. "I could have walked away, started clean somewhere else like you said. But walking away would have meant every one of them died for nothing. And I wasn't willing to be the Mercer who let that happen, not even to spite a father who made me marry a stranger to keep it." Hannah was quiet for a moment, something moving behind her eyes that looked to Cole uncomfortably close to understanding. "My father built his shipping business from one leaking barge on Lake Michigan. He used to say a man who inherits nothing and builds something owes it more loyalty than a man born into wealth ever could because he knows exactly what it cost." She looked down at her plate, then back up. "I think that's why he chose you, if I'm honest. Not because your father offered the best contract terms. Because he read something in your father's letters about a family that fought for land instead of simply owning it, and he thought that kind of fighting might be worth more to a daughter like me than a house in a fine neighborhood ever was. Your father sounds like he thought a great deal about where he was sending you. He did. More than I gave him credit for until today." Something in Hannah's voice caught just slightly before she smoothed it back into the same steady tone she used for everything else. "I was angry when he told me about this arrangement. I thought he was finally admitting what I'd suspected my whole life, that no man would want me on my own merits, so he had to buy one for me with a business deal. It took me the whole train ride to understand he might have been doing something else entirely." "What's that?" "Finding the one man in 2,000 miles who might actually need what I have to offer instead of what I look like." Hannah met his eyes across the table steady, despite the rawness underneath the words. "I don't know yet if that's what you are, Cole. It's been one day, but you stood in front of that whole town today and told them to leave me be, and you sat with me for 2 hours going through papers instead of asking when supper would be ready, and neither of those things is nothing. Neither of us knows much of anything yet," Cole said. "But I meant what I told you at the depot. I'll judge you on what you do. Seems only fair you get the same chance from me." "There's a room made up for you," he said, standing and stretching muscles gone stiff from sitting so long. "Wasn't sure what you'd want, so I had Amos's wife fix up the spare room proper. Figured a woman ought to have her own space coming into a marriage like this one." Something in Hannah's face shifted surprise, and something gentler underneath it. "That was considerate of you." "Didn't seem right to assume anything given how this whole arrangement started." Cole picked up the lamp to light her way. "We can talk more about the ledgers tomorrow. You look wore out." "I am. It's been a very long day." Hannah rose from the desk, gathering her single suitcase, and paused at the bottom of the stairs looking back at him. "Cole." "Yeah, thank you. For today. For the platform and for this." She gestured vaguely at the desk, the papers, the whole conversation that had just passed between them. "I expected to arrive and spend the next year proving myself to a man who'd already decided, same as the rest of this county, that I was a burden his father saddled him with. I didn't expect to be listened to on my first day. Reckon we're both stuck proving ourselves to folks who already made up their minds," Cole said. "Might as well prove it to each other first. Rest of them can catch up whenever they're ready." Hannah almost smiled. Then the closest thing to it he'd seen all day, and climbed the stairs to the room that had been made up for her leaving Cole, standing alone in the lamplight with a desk full of papers that told a story he was only just beginning to understand. And a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling into his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, but that felt for the first time in 8 long months uncomfortably close to hope. He banked the fire, checked the locks out of old habit, and climbed the stairs to his own room. And though the bank still wanted its $2,000, and the town still had its cruel opinions, and nothing about the shape of his troubles had actually changed. In the space of one day, Cole Mercer lay awake that night thinking not about ruin, but about a woman with steady hands and a sharper mind than any banker in Cedar Hollow, who had looked at his father's mess of a ledger and seen not a lost cause, but a problem waiting to be solved. He thought about his father's handwriting on that marriage contract, cramped and urgent, the hand of a dying man racing against time to save what he'd spent his whole life building. He'd hated his father a little for it these past 8 months, hated him for making a choice that wasn't his, to make for trading his son's future, without so much as a conversation. Lying in the dark now, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods outside his window, Cole wondered if his father had known something he couldn't have known himself. Some instinct passed between two men who'd both spent their lives fighting for land that owed them nothing back. He thought about Hollis Pratt's laughter on the depot platform, and Mildred Cotter's practiced pity, and the whole ugly chorus of a town that had already written Hannah Brooks's story before she'd said a single word to any of them. He thought about how wrong they were, how completely and thoroughly wrong, and some old stubborn part of him, the same part that had refused to let the bank simply take the ranch without a fight, settled into something that felt almost like satisfaction at the thought of proving every last one of them wrong together instead of alone. He thought too about the way Hannah had looked at the bank's note, cold and precise, already 3 steps down a road toward answers Cole hadn't even known to look for. 2 extra points of interest, hidden inside language too dense for a grieving man to question. A grazing lease creeping upward year after year, while nobody watched closely enough to notice. Small cruelties wearing the shape of ordinary business bleeding a family dry a few dollars at a time, until the whole thing collapsed, and everyone called it fate, instead of what it actually was. Somewhere past midnight, the wind died down, and the ranch settled into the particular silence of a working place at rest. Cattle quiet in the near pasture, the bunkhouse dark. Sarah and Amos's cabin gone still down by the creek. Cole lay with his hands folded behind his head and let himself imagine just for a moment what Silver Creek might look like a year from now if half of what Hannah suspected turned out to be true. Not a ranch drowning under debts nobody had bothered to question, but a ranch standing clean, paid, and strong-built by 2 people the whole county had been certain would fail before they'd even started. It was a foolish thing to hope for on the strength of one afternoon and a handful of ledgers. Cole knew that. He'd learned the hard way these past 8 months not to trust hope too quickly, not to let himself believe in anything before the numbers proved it true. But he found as sleep finally pulled him under that he was hoping anyway, and for the first time since he'd stood in the barn doorway, reading his father's will with his knuckles split and bleeding, the hope didn't feel foolish at all. It felt instead like the first solid ground he'd stood on in 8 long months, and Cole Mercer slept that night the way a man sleeps when he has finally stopped fighting a war alone. For the first time since the funeral, he fell asleep without doing the arithmetic of everything he stood to lose. Sunrise found Cole already at the kitchen table, and Hannah came down to find him with the Whitfield lease spread out in front of him, reading the same clause over and over like it might change if he stared hard enough. "You didn't sleep either," she said, pouring coffee without waiting to be asked. "Kept thinking about that 3%. Cole didn't look up. 30 years my father dealt with Whitfield on a handshake. Now I'm supposed to believe the man's been quietly robbing us. I didn't say robbing. I said the paperwork drifted somewhere nobody was watching, and it drifted in his favor." Hannah sat across from him, wrapping both hands around her cup. "There's a difference, and it matters, because how we approach him depends on which one it turns out to be. Only one way to find out." "Agreed, but not today." Hannah's tone stopped him before he could push back from the table. "Today we go into town for the banknote, because that's the larger number and the closer deadline. Whitfield can wait a week. First Montana Trust cannot. Cole studied her over the rim of his own cup, still getting used to a wife who gave orders like a foreman and expected to be followed like one too. You planning to walk into Elias Whitmore's office and tell him his own bank cheated my father? I'm planning to walk in and ask him to explain a rate that doesn't match anything else in the territory, and then watch his face while he does it. Something sharp moved behind Hannah's eyes. Men like Whitmore don't panic over accusations, Cole. They panic over questions they weren't ready for. I intend to ask a great many of those. They rode into Cedar Hollow before the heat of the day set in, and word of yesterday's depot scene had clearly beaten them there because the looks on the street had shifted overnight from open mockery to something more careful, more curious. The kind of attention a town pays when it isn't sure yet whether the story it's been telling itself still holds up. "Morning, Mercer," the barber called from his doorway, and there was less swagger in it than there'd been on Friday. "Morning, Sam." Hollis Pratt was nowhere in sight, which suited Cole fine, because he wasn't in the mood for another round with the man, not with First Montana Trust, waiting at the end of the street, like a debt made of brick and glass. The bank was cool and dim inside, smelling of ink and varnish, and Elias Whitmore came out from behind his desk with the particular smile bankers used on customers they expected to disappoint. He was a narrow man, gray at the temples, with small, careful hands that never seemed to stop moving papers, even when there was nothing left to move. "Cole. And this must be the new Mrs. Mercer." Whitmore's eyes flicked over Hannah in the same appraising, dismissive way half the towns had, and Cole felt his jaw tighten watching it happen. "Heard all about the wedding from half my customers this morning. Quite the arrival you made." "Mr. Whitmore." Hannah's voice was perfectly pleasant, perfectly level. "I'd like to ask you about the interest rate on my husband's note." Whitmore's smile flickered just slightly. "That's a conversation for Cole and myself, ma'am. Banking matters aren't really... They're exactly my concern, given that I'll be the one balancing the books that pay it." Hannah set the note on his desk, turned so the rate sat facing him. 9% secured against the full value of the property. I've reviewed comparable secured land loans through my father's shipping concern in Illinois. The prevailing rate on comparable collateral runs 6 to 7%. I'm curious what accounts for the difference here in Montana. The room went quiet enough that Cole could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind Whitmore's desk. "Montana's a harder territory to lend in," Whitmore said, finally, his voice smooth but a shade too quick. "Risk premiums run higher out here. Weather, cattle disease, distance from rail. Any banker worth his license accounts for that. That's a reasonable explanation if it were true across the board." Hannah's tone didn't change at all. "But I took the liberty of asking around before we rode in this morning. The Ashford note, the Colton note, both secured against comparable acreage, both carry 7%. Only the Mercer note sits at 9%. She let that settle. "So either those two ranches present less risk than Silver Creek, for some reason you'd have to explain to me, or the rate on this particular note was set for a reason that has nothing to do with weather or cattle disease." Whitmore's careful hands went still on the desk, for the first time since they'd walked in, and Cole watched something shift behind the man's eyes, calculation replacing charm. "I don't appreciate the implication, Mrs. Mercer. I haven't made one yet. I've only asked a question, and you haven't answered it." Hannah folded her hands and waited, and the silence stretched long enough that Cole felt his own pulse pick up because he'd never in his life seen anyone make Elias Whitmore sweat behind his own desk. "Your husband's father came to me in a difficult moment," Whitmore said, finally choosing his words with visible care now. "Grieving in debt, no leverage to negotiate. I extended credit when another bank might have refused him outright. The rate reflects the circumstances of the loan, not some scheme against your family. That's an answer I can accept as a starting point, Mr. Whitmore, though I notice it still doesn't explain the gap between this note and the Ashford or Colton notes." Hannah rose from her chair, unhurried, and Cole rose with her, still trying to catch up to whatever had just happened in the room. "I'd like a written breakdown of how this rate was calculated, sent to Silver Creek within the week. If it holds up to scrutiny, we'll continue paying as agreed. If it doesn't, I intend to petition for a rate adjustment backed by comparable notes from this same institution. That's not typically how these arrangements work. Then I imagine we'll be setting a new precedent. Hannah offered her hand across the desk, and after a beat too long, Whitmore shook it, his grip stiff and unwilling. Thank you for your time, Mr. Whitmore. We'll expect that breakdown by Friday. They walked out of the bank into the bright morning street, and Cole didn't say anything until they were well clear of the windows, his heart still hammering from watching his wife dismantle a man twice her age in his own office without ever raising her voice. You just accused Elias Whitmore of cheating my father to his face. I asked him a question he couldn't answer honestly. Hannah's hands were steady on the reins as they mounted up, though a flush of color had risen in her cheeks that told Cole the confrontation had cost her something, even if she hadn't shown it inside. Whether that adds up to cheating remains to be seen. But I'd wager good money that written breakdown never arrives, Cole. And if it doesn't, that silence will tell us everything his mouth wouldn't. And if it does arrive, then we'll owe him an apology, and I'll pay it gladly. Hannah looked at him, something like fierce satisfaction still simmering under her composure. But men who set fair rates don't usually go pale when you ask them to justify the numbers, Cole. I've negotiated enough contracts to know the difference between a nervous banker and an honest one. They rode past the Mercantile on the way out of town, and Mildred Cotter stood on the boarding house porch with two other women, all three of them watching openly as Cole and Hannah passed. Cole braced for another round of pitying commentary, but instead Mildred called out hesitant, almost civil. Mrs. Mercer, heard you gave Elias Whitmore quite a morning. News had traveled fast, even by Cedar Hollow standards, and Cole felt a flicker of grim amusement at how quickly a bank teller's gossip could outrun a galloping horse. I asked him some questions about my husband's account. Hannah said polite and even. Nothing more than that. That's not what Delia at the bank's telling it. Mildred's eyes were sharp with curiosity now, the pity from Friday nowhere in evidence. Says you had him red in the face inside of 10 minutes. Says nobody's ever talked to Elias Whitmore that way in his own office, not even Judge Halloway. I find most men respond reasonably to reasonable questions, Mrs. Cotter. Hannah inclined her head politely and nudged her horse forward, leaving Mildred and her companions staring after them with expressions that had shifted in the space of 2 days from cruel amusement to something far more uncertain. They'll be talking about that all week, Cole said once they'd ridden clear of town. Let them talk about the bank instead of my waistline for once. It's an improvement. But there was a small, satisfied curve to Hannah's mouth that told Cole she wasn't entirely indifferent to the shift, however much she pretended otherwise. They rode back toward Silver Creek in a silence that had lost its earlier strain, replaced by something easier, and Cole found himself studying his wife's profile against the morning light, trying to reconcile the woman who'd calmly dismantled a banker with the woman the whole county had spent 2 weeks calling useless. Whitfield's place is on the way, Cole said, as the fork in the road came into view, one path leading straight home, the other curving north toward the Whitfield spread. We could stop. Get that lease sorted while we're already out. Hannah considered it, then shook her head. Not today. I want to review the full history of that lease first, every renewal, every amendment, so I'm not walking in with half the picture the way we nearly did with Whitmore. Whitfield deserves the same chance to explain himself with full information in front of him, and so do we. That's more patience than I've got in me most days. Patience isn't a virtue I was born with either. I learned it the hard way watching my father lose 2 shipping contracts because he moved before he had every fact lined up. Hannah's voice carried the particular weight of a lesson paid for expensively. We'll go to Whitfield prepared, Cole, or we won't go at all. There's too much at stake to let anger set the pace. They rode the rest of the way to Silver Creek, talking through the numbers. Hannah asking sharp, specific questions about the herd, the pasture rotation, the hands' wages, building a fuller picture of the ranch in her head with every mile. And by the time the house came into view, Cole realized he'd talked more freely about Silver Creek's troubles in one morning than he had with anyone since his father died. Amos was waiting by the corral when they rode in, and something in the set of his shoulders told Cole trouble had found them before they'd even dismounted. Lost 2 more head overnight, Amos said without preamble. Found them down near the creek this morning. Same sickness that took the others last winter, near as I can tell, though it's early for it to be showing up in summer. Hannah was off her horse before Cole had finished processing the words, already walking toward Amos with the same focused intensity she'd brought to the ledgers the night before. "Show me." Amos glanced at Cole silently, asking permission for a woman to be giving him instructions on ranch business. And Cole gave a short nod that settled the question, without either of them needing to say anything about it out loud. They walked down toward the creek where 2 steers lay still in the morning light, and Hannah crouched beside the nearest one, without hesitation examining it with a clinical attention that startled Cole all over again. "What do your notes say about the outbreak last winter?" Hannah asked, straightening up, brushing dirt from her skirt without seeming to notice she'd done it. "Symptoms timeline, which pasture the affected cattle were grazing." "Don't rightly have notes," Amos admitted. "Just remember it was bad. Lost 30 head over about 3 weeks. That's a problem we're going to fix immediately starting today." Hannah's voice had gone crisp and urgent. "If this is the same sickness returning, we need records now, not memory 6 months from now. Which pasture were these 2 grazing? South Range mostly, near the old well. The well that hasn't been tested for contamination, I'd guess, given nothing in your father's papers mentioned it." Hannah looked at Cole, a new theory visibly assembling itself behind her eyes. Cole, was the water source the same both times last winter and now? Cole thought back, searching memory that had never had cause to organize itself this way before. Might have been. We do rotate them through the South Range most winters, and again come midsummer. Then that's where we start looking before we lose another head guessing. Hannah was already moving toward the well in question, and Cole found himself following her lead without quite deciding, to Amos falling into step behind them both, muttering something under his breath that might have been surprise or might have been the beginning of respect. The well sat half hidden behind an old stand of cottonwoods, its wooden cover warped and cracked with age, and Hannah knelt beside it, peering down into the dark water below. "There's algae growth here, and the wood's rotted clean through in 2 places." She looked up at Cole. "Contaminated water can cause the kind of illness you're describing, especially in warmer months, when bacteria multiply faster. It's not certain, but it's the first real lead we've had, and it's a far more solvable problem than a mystery curse on the herd." "You think that's it? Bad water, not bad luck. I think it's worth testing before we accept bad luck as an explanation for something that might just be neglect, same as everything else we've found since I got here." Hannah rose, brushing her hands against her skirt again. "I'll need to write to a veterinary contact my father used in Chicago, ask what tests can confirm contamination, without waiting weeks for someone to ride out from Helena. In the meantime, move the herd off this pasture entirely, and seal that well until we know for certain." Amos looked between Cole and Hannah for a long moment, something working itself out behind his weathered face, and then he nodded, slow and deliberate. "I'll get the boys moving them this afternoon." "Thank you, Mr. Guthrie." "Amos is fine, ma'am." Something had shifted in the old foreman's voice, a grudging warmth replacing the careful neutrality from the day before. "Reckon if you can spot what near killed this herd twice inside a season, you've earned the right to call me by my first name, same as everybody else does." Hannah's mouth curved into something close to a real smile, the first one Cole had seen since the depot. "Amos, then." They walked back toward the house together, and Cole caught himself studying her again, the easy authority in her stride, the way she'd moved from ledgers to cattle disease, without missing a step, like her mind simply refused to accept that any problem was beyond solving if you looked at it clearly enough. "You're not what this county expected," Cole said, before he'd fully decided to say it out loud. "No, I gathered that from the depot." Hannah glanced sideways at him, something wry in her expression. "Disappointed. Opposite, if I'm honest." The words came out plainer than he'd intended, and he watched something flicker across her face in response, surprise mixed with a caution that told him she wasn't used to hearing that kind of honesty aimed her way. "Reckon I ought to write my father a thank you wherever he's listening from for choosing better than I gave him credit for." Hannah didn't answer right away, and when she did, her voice had gone quieter, less certain than the confident tone she used for ledgers and bankers and sick cattle. "It's been one day, Cole. Don't go handing out gratitude you might want back once you've seen the rest of me. Reckon I'll take my chances. They ate supper that evening with Amos and Sarah and Ricky at the long table in the kitchen, the first meal since Hannah's arrival, that felt less like a negotiation and more like something ordinary, and Cole watched his wife hold her own in conversation about cattle prices and weather patterns, with a fluency that left Ricky in particular staring at her with open reassessment. "You really talk to old man Whitmore like that?" Ricky said halfway through the meal, unable to hold the question in any longer. "Delia at the bank's telling half of Cedar Hollow you had him sweating." "I asked him questions he didn't have good answers for," Hannah said, buttering a piece of bread with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything else. "That tends to make men sweat in my experience. Bet Hollis Pratt about choked on his own tongue hearing that." Ricky grinned, and Sarah shot him a warning look across the table, though there was amusement in it too. "Sorry, ma'am. Just folks in town have been saying some real ugly things this week, and it's something hearing you gave old Whitmore a run for his money instead." "I've heard what folks in town have been saying, Ricky. You needn't apologize on their behalf." Hannah's tone stayed light, but Cole caught the flicker of old weariness underneath it, the particular fatigue of a woman who'd spent her whole life absorbing cruelty and learning not to let it show. "I've found the best answer to that kind of talk isn't arguing with it. It's simply making it stop mattering one solved problem at a time." The table went quiet for a moment, and then Amos raised his coffee cup in something like a toast. "Well, you solved 2 problems today that I know of, and it ain't even been a full week. Reckon Silver Creek's due for some good luck after the year we've had." "Not luck," Hannah said, and something steady and certain had returned to her voice. "Attention. There's a difference, and I intend for this ranch to have plenty of it from here forward." 3 days later, the written breakdown from First Montana Trust still hadn't arrived exactly as Hannah predicted, and Cole found her at the kitchen table before dawn again, this time with a letter of her own, half-finished, addressed to a name he didn't recognize in Helena. "Who's Franklin Reyes?" he asked, reading the address upside down. "An attorney my father's business has used for territorial disputes. I wrote to him yesterday, asking what recourse exists if a bank sets a discriminatory rate on a loan without adequate justification." Hannah didn't look up from the letter, her pen moving in quick, decisive strokes. "I'd rather have that answer in hand before Whitmore's silence forces our next move instead of scrambling for it afterward." "You think it'll come to that? Lawyers. I think men like Whitmore only change course when the cost of staying the course outweighs the cost of correcting it. And right now, he has no reason to believe anyone will ever hold him accountable for that rate." Hannah finally looked up, and there was something harder in her eyes than Cole had seen, yet a coldness that made him understand for the first time exactly how far she was willing to go. "I intend to become that reason." They rode to the Whitfield place that same afternoon, ledger copies in hand, and found Silas Whitfield out by his own corral, a broad, sun-weathered man who greeted Cole with the easy familiarity of 30 years' acquaintance, and Hannah with a curious, careful nod. "Cole, and the new Mrs. Mercer, I presume. Word's been traveling about you, ma'am." Whitfield's tone was friendlier than Whitmore's had been, but Cole caught the wariness underneath it, the sense of a man who'd already heard how the bank meeting went, and was bracing himself for something similar. "Mr. Whitfield, I'd like to discuss the grazing lease for the northern pasture access," Hannah said, direct as ever, though her tone carried less edge than it had with the banker. "Specifically, the percentage clause." Whitfield's easy expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went carefully neutral. "That lease has run the same since your father-in-law and I first shook hands on it, ma'am. 15% fair as the day is long. According to the document itself, it's currently 18%, and has been for at least the last renewal cycle." Hannah produced the paper from her satchel and held it out. "I'm not accusing you of anything deliberate, Mr. Whitfield. I understand renewal clauses can shift, without either party fully tracking the change over a decade of handshake dealing, but I would like to understand how it happened, and I'd like to discuss returning the rate to 15% going forward." Whitfield took the paper, read it slowly, and something in his weathered face shifted from wariness to genuine surprise. "This ain't right. I never asked for 18. Lease renewal 3 years back. I had my nephew draw up the paperwork while I was laid up with a bad hip. Boy's not much for numbers, but I trusted him to copy the terms, same as always. Is it possible he made an error rather than an intentional change? More than possible, likely knowing that boy. Whitfield looked genuinely troubled, now turning the paper over like it might explain itself better from another angle. I owe your family an apology, Cole, and a refund on the difference if this has been running wrong 3 years like it looks. We appreciate that, Mr. Whitfield. Cole said some of the tension he'd been carrying since the depot loosening in his chest at the sight of an honest man, owning an honest mistake, so different from the careful evasions they'd gotten from Whitmore. 15% corrected effective immediately, and I'll work out a fair repayment for the difference over the past 3 years, Whitfield said, extending his hand to Hannah this time instead of Cole. You've got a sharp eye, Mrs. Mercer. Wish more folks in this county looked at their paperwork as close as you do. Most folks don't have the time, Mr. Whitfield. I understand that. I only ask that going forward you make the time same as we intend to. Hannah shook his hand firmly, and Cole watched something settle in her shoulders as they rode away from the Whitfield place, a small, genuine victory in a week that had mostly consisted of hard-fought ones. Not every man in this county's a Whitmore, Cole said, once they were back on the road home. No, and that matters more than I expected it to. Hannah was quiet for a moment, watching the hills roll past. I came out here half convinced every business dealing in this territory would be some version of what we found at the bank. It's good to be wrong about that even once. That night, word of this Whitfield correction had somehow already reached Sarah before they'd finished unsaddling the horses, carried on whatever invisible current carried all news across Cedar Hollow faster than any rider could manage it, and Sarah greeted them at the door with an expression that had shifted in the space of a week from cautious appraisal to something warmer. 3% back and old Whitfield owning up to his own mistake without a fight, Sarah said, shaking her head as she set supper on the table. Whole Valley's going to be talking about this by Sunday services. Let them talk, Hannah said, settling into her chair with the particular tiredness of a day well spent. So long as what they're saying is true, I've stopped minding much what it costs to hear it. But not everyone in the valley took the news the way Whitfield had. Word came to Silver Creek 2 days later, carried by Ricky, after a trip into town for supplies, that Elias Whitmore had been overheard at the saloon, complaining loudly about meddling wives who didn't know their place, and that a man Cole didn't recognize by name, a land buyer working for interest out of Helena, had been asking pointed questions around town about which ranches in the valley were behind on their notes. Asking what kind of questions? Cole pressed when Ricky relayed the story over supper. Wanted to know which spreads were struggling. Whitfield's the Colton's ours. Fella by the name of Garrett Voss, according to the bartender, said he represents a consortium looking to consolidate grazing land in the valley, whatever that means exactly. Ricky shrugged clearly out of his depth with the specifics. Struck me as odd is all. Man asking that particular after Whitmore's been going around complaining about us. Hannah went very still across the table, and Cole watched calculation move fast behind her eyes, the same expression she'd worn reading the banknote that first night. Consolidate grazing land, she repeated slowly. Cole, did your father ever mention anyone by that name, Voss? Not that I recall. I'd like to know more about him before we assume it's coincidence, a land consolidator showing interest in this valley. The same season half its ranches are struggling under notes that might be running higher than they should. Hannah's voice had gone flat and careful, the tone she used when a theory was assembling itself faster than she wanted to say out loud. It would be a remarkably convenient coincidence, wouldn't it? Struggling ranches, inflated rates nobody questions, and a buyer waiting to scoop up the land once the banks foreclose. The table went quiet, the easy warmth of the meal draining into something colder, and Cole felt the floor tilt beneath him for the third time that week. The same sick lurch he'd felt reading his father's will, reading the banknote standing on the depot platform, waiting for a bride he'd been told would ruin him. You think Whitmore's working with this Voss fella? Amos said slowly. Setting rates high on purpose so ranches fail so Voss can buy them cheap once the bank forecloses. I think it's a theory that fits the facts we have, and I intend to find out whether it holds up before I say it out loud to anyone outside this table." Hannah's eyes moved around the room, steady and serious. "If I'm right, this isn't just about Silver Creek anymore. It's about every ranch in this valley carrying a note from First Montana Trust, and that changes what we do next considerably." "What do we do next?" Cole asked. "We stop fighting this alone." Hannah set down her fork, and something resolute settled over her features, the look of a woman who'd just decided on a course of action, and wasn't inclined to waver from it. If Whitfield's lease drifted by accident, that's one story. But if Whitmore's rate was set on purpose, other ranches in this valley are likely carrying the same burden, and none of them know it yet, same as you didn't. I think it's time we found out who else is struggling under a note that doesn't add up before Garrett Voss finds them first. Over the following 2 weeks, Hannah began a quiet campaign that Cole watched unfold with a mixture of admiration and unease, riding out with him to visit neighboring ranches under the pretense of welcome calls. A new bride making the rounds of the valley, while in truth, gathering information with the same patient thoroughness she'd brought to Cole's own ledgers. The Coltons, a young couple 2 years into their own struggling operation, admitted over coffee that their note also carried 9%, and that a man named Voss had visited them just the week before, offering what he called a generous buyout should things become difficult. "Difficult how?" Hannah asked, and Mrs. Colton, a thin, tired woman, not much older than Hannah herself, had looked at her husband before answering. He didn't say exactly. Just that debts have a way of getting away from a young operation, and that his offer wouldn't stay open forever. Mrs. Colton twisted her apron in her hands. "Scared us some, if I'm honest. Felt less like an offer, and more like a warning." "It was likely both," Hannah said grimly, and Cole watched her file the detail away with the same careful precision she brought to every piece of information she gathered, building toward something Cole couldn't yet see the shape of, though he could feel its weight growing heavier with every ranch they visited. At the Ashford place, the story was different, but no less troubling. Their note carried the standard 7%, but Mr. Ashford mentioned almost in passing that Whitmore had recently pressured him to take on additional debt to expand his herd debt. Ashford hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. "Said it'd be foolish not to grow while the market's favorable," Ashford said, scratching his head. "Didn't think much of it at the time. Bankers are always pushing something." "Did he mention Garrett Voss or any consolidation interest in the valley?" "Can't say he did, no." Ashford frowned. "Why should I be worried?" "I'm not certain yet, Mr. Ashford, but I'd think carefully before taking on any debt Whitmore suggests you don't need, at least until we understand a bit more about his reasoning." Hannah's warning was gentle but unmistakable, and Cole watched the older rancher's easy confidence flicker into something more guarded as the implication settled in. By the time they'd visited 5 ranches in 2 weeks, a pattern had emerged clear enough that even Cole, who'd spent his whole life trusting bankers the way he trusted weather, could no longer explain it away as coincidence. Every struggling ranch carried an inflated rate. Every ranch approached by Voss had been softened up first by debt they hadn't needed, pushed by a banker with every reason to want them drowning by the time the buyer came calling. Garrett Voss himself rode out to Silver Creek on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, a lean man in a city-cut coat, too fine for range dust, sitting his horse like a man who'd learned to ride for appearances rather than necessity. Cole was mending fence near the house when he spotted the rider coming up the drive, and something in his gut went tight before the man had even opened his mouth. "Cole Mercer." Voss dismounted with an easy, practiced smile, extending a hand Cole didn't hurry to take. "Garrett Voss. Represent a consortium of investors out of Helena looking at opportunities across the valley. Hoped I might have a word." "About what?" "About Silver Creek's position mostly. Heard you've had a difficult year. Herd losses, a note coming due, that sort of thing." Voss's smile didn't waver, though his eyes moved past Cole toward the house, cataloging, assessing the way a man looks at something he's already decided he wants. "My consortium's prepared to offer fair value for operations facing hardship." "No shame in it, Cole. Plenty of good ranches don't survive a bad run of luck." Better to sell on your own terms than lose it all to the bank with nothing to show for it. Hannah stepped out onto the porch before Cole could answer, drawn by the sound of a stranger's voice, and Voss's easy smile flickered for just a moment at the sight of her recalculating. "And you'd be the new Mrs. Mercer. I've heard a great deal about you this week." Something in the way he said it carried an edge Cole didn't like, a warning dressed up as pleasantry. "Quite the reputation you've built in a short time. Elias Whitmore in particular seems eager to see the back of you. Mr. Voss?" Hannah came down the porch steps unhurried, her eyes steady on him in a way that made the man's smile tighten at the corners. "I understand you've been visiting struggling ranches across the valley with buyout offers. Silver Creek isn't struggling, and it isn't for sale. Not yet, perhaps." Voss's tone stayed pleasant, but something colder moved underneath it now. "Notes have a way of coming due faster than a rancher expects, Mrs. Mercer. I'd hate to see you turn down a fair offer today, only to accept a far worse one from the bank in a few months' time, once circumstances have changed." "What circumstances would those be precisely?" Hannah's voice was mild, almost curious, but Cole recognized the particular stillness in her that meant she was hunting for something in the exchange, testing the man's footing the way she'd tested Whitmore's. Voss hesitated just a fraction too long. "Circumstances change, ma'am. That's all I mean by it. Weather prices, the usual troubles this territory hands every rancher sooner or later." "That's a curious answer for a man who seemed so certain a moment ago." Hannah tilted her head slightly. "Almost as though you know something about Silver Creek's circumstances that we don't." "I know how to read a balance sheet same as you from what I hear." Voss's smile had gone thin now, the charm wearing at the edges. "I'll leave my card. The offer stands for 30 days, should you reconsider." "We won't," Cole said, flat and final, stepping between Voss and the porch in a way that left no room for further pleasantries. "This land's been Mercer land 3 generations. It isn't going to Helena investors while I'm still breathing." Voss studied him for a moment, something calculating and faintly amused behind his eyes, then remounted with the same unhurried ease he'd arrived with. "Admirable sentiment, Mr. Mercer. We'll see how it holds up." He tipped his hat toward Hannah, a gesture that felt more like a threat than courtesy. "Mrs. Mercer, a pleasure." They watched him ride off down the drive, and Cole didn't let out the breath he'd been holding until the man was well out of sight. "He knows something," Hannah said quietly, once Voss had disappeared over the ridge. That hesitation before he answered about circumstances. He wasn't guessing when he said notes come due faster than expected, Cole. He was telling us something he already knows is coming. "Whitmore." Cole said the name like a curse. Whitmore or someone above him. Voss didn't ride 200 miles from Helena on a hunch. Someone's telling him which ranches are worth watching and telling him before the ranchers themselves have any warning. Hannah's jaw tightened, the same resolute look Cole had seen the night she'd first opened his father's ledgers. "We need that written breakdown from the bank more than ever now, Cole. Because if Voss already knows what's coming for us, we're already behind, and I don't intend to stay behind for long." "It's not luck," Hannah said one night, laying out her notes across the kitchen table like a general planning a campaign. "It's not fate, and it's not a hard territory, same as Whitmore claimed to my face. It's a design Cole built slow and careful enough that no single rancher would ever see the whole shape of it, only their own piece. How do we prove it? We don't, not yet, not with what we have. Suspicion isn't evidence, and accusing Whitmore without proof would only warn him to cover his tracks more carefully." Hannah's jaw was set in a way Cole was coming to recognize the look of a woman who'd found an enemy worth the trouble of a proper fight. "What we do is make certain Silver Creek can't be bled the way the others have been, and we make certain the other ranches in this valley understand what's happening to them, so that when the proof does surface, they're standing together, instead of scattered and afraid, each one thinking their trouble is theirs alone." Cole looked at his wife across the papers spread between them. 3 weeks. Married to a woman who'd arrived under a cloud of cruel gossip and had since dismantled a banker, corrected a decade-old lease, likely saved a herd from contaminated water, and was now quietly assembling a case against a conspiracy that stretched across half the valley. And he felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't expected to feel this soon. Something that went beyond gratitude. beyond the careful trust they'd agreed to extend each other at the depot 3 weeks earlier. "County's still talking about you, you know," he said. "Different talk than before, but talking all the same." "What are they saying now?" "That the Mercer boy married the smartest woman in the territory and doesn't know how good he's got it." Cole watched her face carefully as he said it, wanting to see how the words landed. "Reckon they might be right about that." Hannah went still, something vulnerable moving across her features before she caught it and folded it back away the same way she'd folded away every soft thing since she'd stepped off that train. "That's a different kind of talk than what met me on the platform. Whole Valley's slow to admit when it's wrong. Give them time." Cole reached across the table, not quite touching her hand close enough that the space between them felt deliberate charged. "I'm not slow, though. Took me exactly 3 weeks to see what this county's going to take considerably longer to figure out." "And what's that?" "That my father made the smartest deal of his life sending for you." The words came out rougher than he intended, more honest than he'd planned to be, and he watched Hannah's composure crack just slightly at the edges, something warm and uncertain replacing the careful guard she wore like armor. "Reckon I owe him that apology I mentioned wherever he's listening." Outside, the last light was fading over the hills that 3 generations of Mercers had bled and died to keep, and somewhere beyond that horizon, a banker was quietly building a debt designed to fail, and a man named Garrett Voss was waiting to collect the pieces. But inside the kitchen of Silver Creek Ranch, for the first time since his father's funeral, Cole Mercer found himself looking at his future with something other than dread, and finding to his own quiet astonishment that the woman sitting across from him had become the reason why. Hannah gathered her notes into their careful stack, squaring the edges the way she always did, but her hands lingered a moment longer than necessary before she looked up at him again. "We have a great deal of work ahead of us, Cole. Whitmore isn't going to stop because we've asked polite questions, and Voss isn't going to lose interest in this valley because a handful of ranchers start comparing notes." Her voice was steady, but something new had crept into it, a warmth that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, standing on a depot platform with a whole county waiting to laugh at her. "I need you to understand that the fight in front of us is only beginning. I understood that the day I read my father's will," Cole said. "Difference now is, I'm not fighting it alone." "No?" Hannah agreed, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, her smile reached all the way to her eyes. "You're not." The written breakdown from First Montana Trust finally arrived 11 days late, and Hannah read it twice at the kitchen table before she set it down and looked at Cole with an expression that told him everything before she said a word. "It's nothing," she said. 2 paragraphs of general risk language, no comparison figures, no actual calculation. He's stalling. Stalling toward what? Toward whatever Voss already knows is coming. Hannah pushed the letter across the table, and Cole scanned it, finding exactly what she'd described. Vague words dressed up to look like an answer. Franklin Reyes wrote back yesterday, too. He confirms the rate looks discriminatory on its face, but says any formal petition would take months to move through territorial courts. Months we may not have. Cole felt the old dread creeping back into his chest, the same weight he'd carried before her train pulled into Cedar Hollow. So the lawyer's no help. He's help for a fight 6 months from now. He's no help for a payment coming due in... Hannah stopped herself, some new tension crossing her face. "Cole, when exactly does the deadline the will specified actually fall due? The marriage satisfied the contract, but I never asked what happens with the note itself once that condition was met." "Payments due same as always, quarterly 1st of the month." Cole thought about it, unease building. "Next one's in 9 days. Before Hannah could answer, the sound of a horse coming up too fast pulled them both toward the window, and Ricky came through the yard at a gallop that told Cole something was badly wrong before the boy had even reined in. "Blackleg," Ricky said, breathless, swinging down from the saddle. "Colton's whole south herd. 20 head dead since yesterday, and it's spreading fast. Same sickness hit the Ashford place overnight, too. Whole valley's in a panic, Cole. Prices at the Helena stockyard dropped near 40% this morning soon as word got out." Hannah was on her feet immediately. 40%. That's what the wire said. Buyers spooked figured if it's in the valley, it might be in every herd. Nobody wants to risk buying disease stock. Ricky's face was pale under the dust. Coltons are talking about selling out entirely. Heard Voss rode straight for their place soon as the news broke. Cole felt the ground shift under him again, faster this time, the way disaster seemed to move once it started moving at all. Our herd. Nothing yet far as I can tell. But Amos wants you out at the South Range now, just in case. They rode hard for the pasture, and Cole spent the ride running numbers in his head that added up worse every time, cattle prices collapsing, right as a payment came due. A disease sweeping the valley with the particular speed of catastrophe, and somewhere behind all of it, a man in a fine coat who'd already known circumstances were about to change. Amos met them at the fence line, and the relief on his face when he saw them was the first good sign of the day. Herd's clean, best I can tell. No fever, no lameness. But we're not out of the woods, not with it this close. We quarantine, Hannah said immediately. No mixing with any outside stock. No shared water sources with neighboring herds, and I want every animal checked twice daily until this passes. Already started on it, Amos said, and something in his voice carried real respect. Now the last traces of doubt from that first day at the corral, long gone. Figured you'd want it done that way soon as I heard. Cole watched his foreman defer to his wife's judgment without hesitation, and felt a fierce, unexpected pride move through him, even in the middle of the crisis. The same pride he'd felt watching her dismantle Whitmore in his own office. They rode back toward the house as the light started to fail. And that was when they found Elias Whitmore's man waiting on the porch, a young clerk clutching an envelope like it might bite him. "Letter from the bank, Mr. Mercer," the clerk said, handing it over quickly and mounting up again before Cole had even broken the seal, like he wanted to be gone before anyone could ask him questions. Cole read it standing in the yard, and the words seemed to swim for a moment before they settled into something he understood with sick, total clarity. "He's calling the note," Cole said, his voice strange in his own ears. "Full balance due in 7 days, citing a clause about market instability threatening the collateral's value." Hannah snatched the letter from his hands and read it herself, her jaw tightening with every line. "That clause exists for genuine emergencies, not manufactured ones. He's using the blackleg outbreak as an excuse. An outbreak that conveniently started spreading through this valley the same week Garrett Voss came asking which ranches were worth watching. You think he did this? I think it's too convenient to be coincidence, but I can't prove that, and proof isn't what matters right now." Hannah's hands were shaking just slightly, the first time Cole had seen her anything less than perfectly composed. "What matters is that we owe $2,000 in 7 days instead of the weeks we thought we had, and our herd is worth 40% less than it was yesterday morning." The number sat between them like a physical weight, and Cole felt something in his chest crack open, the particular despair of watching a fight he'd thought he was winning turn instantly, brutally unwinnable. "There's no way," he said quietly. "Even selling the whole herd at these prices, we come up short. And selling the whole herd means there's nothing left to rebuild with, even if we somehow scrape together the payment." Hannah didn't answer right away. She walked into the house, sat down at the desk, and stared at the ledgers for a long time without touching them, and Cole watched her, the way a drowning man watches the shore, desperate for some plan to surface from behind her still calculating expression. "There's one option," she said finally. "It's reckless. It might be the worst decision either of us ever makes. But it's the only one I can see that doesn't end with Voss standing on this land within the month. Tell me, we don't sell the herd to cover the note. We sell almost everything else, every asset we can liquidate fast, and we use it combined with what savings my father settled on me before I left Chicago to buy an elite breeding line, while prices are collapsed across the entire territory." Hannah's eyes had gone bright and fierce, the look of a gambler who'd found the one hand worth playing everything on. "Blooded stock resistant to disease, capable of commanding premium prices even in a depressed market, because quality always recovers faster than the general herd. If we buy now at the bottom, we could rebuild Silver Creek stronger than it's ever been. And if it fails, we lose everything faster than we would have otherwise, and Voss gets exactly what he wants regardless." Hannah held his gaze unflinching. I won't pretend the risk isn't real, Cole. But staying cautious means losing slowly, and I don't believe slow losing saves this ranch any more than fast losing does. I believe the only way through this is forward, all the way forward with nothing held back. Cole sat with it, the weight of 3 generations of Mercer land pressing down on him harder than it ever had. And he thought about his father's cramped, urgent handwriting on that marriage contract. A dying man betting everything on a stranger from Chicago, because he'd sensed somehow that caution alone wasn't going to save what he'd spent his life building. Where do we even find a breeding line like that on 7 days' notice? He asked. There's a rancher outside Bozeman, a man named Delacroix, breeding Hereford stock resistant to blackleg and half the other sicknesses that plague this territory. My father's associate mentioned him in a letter last year before any of this started. If the price has collapsed there too, and I suspect it has, we might be able to buy in at a fraction of what that bloodline would cost in a normal season. And if Delacroix doesn't want to sell that cheap, then we negotiate, and if negotiation fails, we find another way, but we don't sit here doing nothing while the clock runs out. Hannah stood already moving toward the desk drawer where she kept her correspondence. I'll write to Delacroix tonight, send it by the fastest rider we can find. We ride for Bozeman ourselves the day after tomorrow, assuming he answers, because a letter alone won't close a deal this large in the time we have. They didn't sleep that night, working through the numbers by lamplight, and by morning, Hannah had a plan laid out with the same precision she'd brought to every ledger she'd ever untangled, a desperate narrow path through disaster that depended on a stranger's willingness to sell and a bloodline's ability to survive a Montana winter. Word of the bank's early call spread through Cedar Hollow within a day, the way every piece of Silver Creek's business seemed to spread now. And when Cole rode into town for supplies, he found the mood had curdled back toward the cruelty of that first week, sharpened now by genuine crisis instead of mere gossip. Heard Whitmore's calling in your note, Hollis Pratt said from the mercantile steps, no longer grinning, something almost gleeful in his grim satisfaction instead. Heard your fancy wife's scheme with the bank finally caught up to you. Should have kept your head down instead of picking fights with a man who holds your whole ranch in his hand. We didn't pick a fight, Hollis. We asked a question he couldn't answer honestly. Don't matter what you asked. Matters what he can do about it, and word is he's about to do plenty. Hollis shook his head with the particular relish of a man who'd been waiting for vindication. County's saying you two are about to lose everything on account of a woman who couldn't leave well enough alone. Cole felt the old anger rise sharper now than it had been at the depot, because this time the stakes were real and the mockery cut correspondingly deeper. You'll eat those words, Hollis. Will I now? Hollis's grin came back ugly and certain. Whole valley's watching Silver Creek circle the drain, Cole. Ain't nothing your Chicago bride can do to stop a note coming due faster than you can pay it. Cole didn't answer him. He loaded his supplies in silence and rode home with his jaw set hard enough to ache, and that night he told Hannah what Hollis had said, bracing for some flicker of the old wound he'd seen cross her face that first day at the depot. Instead, her expression only hardened into something colder and more determined. Let them watch. In 7 days, either we've lost everything, in which case their gossip won't matter to us anymore, or we've done something this county has never seen a struggling ranch do, and their gossip won't matter for an entirely different reason. Delacroix's reply came back 2 days later, carried by a rider Hannah had paid handsomely to make the round trip in record time. And the letter agreed to a meeting, but offered no promises on price, which left them with no choice but to ride for Bozeman themselves and negotiate face-to-face gambling. 4 days of travel against a 7-day deadline that grew tighter with every mile. They rode hard, stopping only when the horses demanded it, and Cole watched Hannah endure 2 days of brutal saddle time without complaint, her jaw set the same way his was, both of them running the same arithmetic of hours and dollars over and over in their heads. Delacroix turned out to be a broad, weathered Frenchman, with a herd that looked even from a distance, healthier and more solidly built than anything Cole had seen in the valley cattle, with the particular gleam of animals bred with real intention, instead of left to chance. You've come a long way for cattle, Madam Mercer, Delacroix said, studying them both with shrewd, unhurried eyes. Word travels even to Bozeman. Your bank troubles this Voss and his consortium sniffing around the valley. I confess I am curious what a ranch on the edge of ruin intends to do with premium breeding stock. Survive, Hannah said simply. And not merely survive. Recover faster and stronger than anyone expects, because quality cattle command quality prices, even in a depressed market, and depressed markets don't last forever. A reasonable theory, difficult to execute with a bank breathing down your neck. Delacroix's eyes moved to Cole. And you, Mr. Mercer, you trust your wife's theory enough to bet the whole of your family's land on it. Cole didn't hesitate, and the certainty of his own answer surprised him even as he gave it. I trust her more than I've trusted anyone since my father died. If she says this is the way through, then this is the way through. Something shifted in Delacroix's weathered face, a shrewd assessment giving way to something like respect. That's either love or foolishness, Mr. Mercer, and I confess I've rarely seen the two travel separately. Reckon it's both, Cole said. And beside him, he felt rather than saw Hannah go still, at the word something warm and startled moving behind her careful composure. The negotiation that followed took the better part of 2 hours, Hannah matching Delacroix point for point on bloodlines and market conditions and disease resistance rates. And Cole watched with something close to awe as his wife talked a shrewd French breeder down from an opening price that would have bankrupted them twice over, to a figure that left them stretched to the absolute limit, but not beyond it. 40 head, Delacroix said finally, extending his hand across the negotiation with the particular respect one skilled trader offers another. My finest breeding line disease-resistant stock proven across 3 generations. You drive a hard bargain, Madame Mercer. I begin to think your husband's confidence in you was not foolishness after all. Thank you, Monsieur Delacroix. You won't regret trusting Silver Creek with this bloodline. I regret nothing yet, Madame, because I have not yet been paid. Delacroix's eyes carried a glint of dry humor. Let us complete the transaction before either of us grows too sentimental about it. Every dollar they had, every asset Hannah had liquidated in 2 frantic days before they'd left the ranch. Every cent of savings her father had settled on her before she boarded that train went into 40 head of cattle that would either save Silver Creek or bury it twice as deep. And Cole signed the final papers with a hand that didn't shake, though his heart hammered hard enough that he wondered if Hannah could hear it beside him. They drove the herd back toward Silver Creek over 3 grueling days, moving slower than they had, riding out 40 valuable animals, demanding careful handling across unfamiliar country. And Cole found himself watching the cattle with a fierce protective attention he'd never felt for livestock before, because these 40 animals now represented every hope his family had left. On the second day, 2 riders appeared on a ridge above the trail and sat their horses watching the herd move past for longer than seemed like idle curiosity. And Cole felt his stomach tighten with a suspicion he couldn't quite prove. You see them? He said to Hannah, keeping his voice low. I see them. Hannah didn't look up at the ridge directly, keeping her eyes on the herd. Instead, though, Cole could tell she was tracking the riders in the corner of her vision, same as he was. Could be nothing. Could be drovers checking on their own stock somewhere nearby. Could be Voss's men making sure we don't get this herd home in one piece. Could be that too. Hannah's jaw set hard. Either way, we don't stop and we don't show them we're worried. Keep the herd moving tight, Cole. If they mean trouble, I'd rather meet it on our own terms than sit here waiting for it to come find us. The riders shadowed them for the better part of an hour before finally dropping back and disappearing over the far side of the ridge, and Cole didn't fully release the breath he'd been holding until they were well past the spot, though the unease of it stayed with him. The rest of the ride, a reminder that whatever they'd started in Bozeman, someone out there was watching closely enough to notice. They arrived back at the ranch with 2 days to spare before the note came due, and the whole valley seemed to hold its breath, watching what would happen next, gossip curdling into something closer to genuine anticipation as word spread that the Mercers had returned from Bozeman with a herd nobody in Cedar Hollow had ever seen the like of. Amos met them at the gate, and his weathered face upon seeing the cattle went through several stages of disbelief before settling into something like wonder. Lord Almighty! Never seen stock built like that outside a stockyard catalog. Delacroix's breeding line? Hannah said, exhaustion and triumph mixed equally in her voice. Disease-resistant premium quality, worth double what we paid for them, even at collapsed prices, assuming the market recovers even partway in the next several months. And if it don't recover, then we've lost everything on a gamble, instead of losing it slowly to a rigged banknote, and I'd rather lose fighting than lose kneeling Amos. I suspect you understand that better than most. Amos studied the cattle a moment longer, then nodded slowly, some old stubborn approval settling into his weathered features. Reckon I do at that. Word of the Bozeman purchase reached Cedar Hollow within a day, and the reaction split the valley in ways Cole hadn't anticipated. Some, like Hollis Pratt, treated it as final proof of Hannah's recklessness, a Chicago woman gambling away the last of the Mercer legacy on cattle nobody in Montana had ever heard of. Others, quieter voices Cole hadn't expected to hear from, started asking careful questions about Delacroix's bloodline, about disease resistance, about whether the gamble might actually pay off in a market that everyone privately expected to recover eventually. The $2,000 came due on a Tuesday, and Hannah rode into town herself to deliver it, refusing to let Cole make the trip alone, standing beside him in Elias Whitmore's office, while the banker counted the payment with visible, poorly concealed disappointment. Full payment as agreed, Hannah said, watching him count it twice like he expected to find it short. Despite the accelerated timeline, despite the market collapse you cited as justification, despite everything your consortium friend seemed so certain would happen to us. Whitmore's eyes came up sharp at the mention of Voss, something guarded moving behind his careful expression. I don't know what you're implying, Mrs. Mercer. I'm not implying anything anymore, Mr. Whitmore. I'm simply observing that you called this note early citing a market emergency, and we met it anyway, in a way I doubt you anticipated when you sent that letter. Hannah's voice carried no triumph, only cold, precise satisfaction. I'd think carefully about what you tell Mr. Voss next time he rides into this territory asking which ranches are worth watching. Silver Creek isn't one of them, not anymore. They rode home together in silence for a while, the tension of the last 2 weeks slowly draining out of both of them, replaced by an exhaustion so complete Cole could barely feel his own hands on the reins. And they hadn't gone half a mile before a familiar city-cut coat came into view on the road ahead. Garrett Voss sitting his horse square in their path like he'd been waiting for them. Mr. Voss, Hannah said, reining up, her voice gone flat and careful. Word travels fast in this territory. Voss's easy charm had thinned considerably since their last meeting, something harder showing through the cracks now. Heard you made your payment. Ambitious for a woman 3 months off the train. I'd think carefully before you make this personal, Mr. Voss. Hannah's tone didn't waver. Whatever arrangement you and Mr. Whitmore have built between yourselves, it's about to become a great deal more difficult to maintain. You think one payment is going to trouble men who've been doing this a long time, Mrs. Mercer? Voss's smile had gone thin and cold. This valley isn't the first territory my consortium has worked. It won't be the last. Maybe not. But it might be the first territory where the rancher stopped believing her trouble was simply bad luck. Cole's voice came out harder than he intended, and he found he didn't care. You ought to ride on Voss. Nothing left for you here but a fight you're going to lose. Voss studied them both for a long moment, calculation moving behind his eyes, and then he tipped his hat with a gesture that had lost every trace of its earlier courtesy, and rode off toward town without another word. And Cole watched him go with the uneasy certainty that they'd made an enemy who wasn't finished with them yet. A week later, with the immediate crisis behind them, but the larger fight against Whitmore and Voss still unresolved, Hannah called the valley's struggling ranchers together at Silver Creek, a gathering. Cole had watched her plan with the same meticulous care she brought to everything else. Letters sent to every family they'd visited. A supper laid out by Sarah generous enough to make the meeting feel like something other than a council of war. The Coltons came, and the Ashfords and Whitfield rode over, despite having no note to worry about himself, standing at the back of the front room with his arms crossed, listening. I asked you all here because I believe every struggling note in this valley traces back to the same source. Hannah said, standing at the head of the room with the same composed authority she'd used to face down Whitmore in his own office. I can't prove collusion between Elias Whitmore and Garrett Voss in a court of law, not yet. But I can show you the pattern, and I believe once you see it laid out together, you'll understand why standing separately hasn't protected any of us. She walked them through it methodically. The inflated rates, the timing of Voss's visits, the accelerated call on Silver Creek's note, timed precisely with a disease outbreak that had struck with suspicious speed and breadth, and Cole watched the faces around the room shift from skepticism to grim recognition as pieces of their own experience slotted into the shape Hannah was describing. He tried to push me into debt I didn't need, Ashford said slowly, working through it out loud. Right before Voss came asking about struggling ranches. Didn't think much of the timing till now. He offered us a lifeline right when we were most scared. Mrs. Colton added, her voice tight. Made it feel like kindness. Didn't feel like a trap till you laid it out this way. That's precisely the design, Hannah said. It only works if each ranch believes its trouble is isolated private, a matter of bad luck, rather than bad faith. The moment we compare notes, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and a pattern this size is far harder for Whitmore to explain away than any single complaint. What do you propose we do about it? Whitfield asked from the back of the room. Document everything. Every rate, every pressured loan, every visit from Voss, every discrepancy, any of you can find in your own paperwork. Send copies to Franklin Reyes and Helena, an attorney my father's business trusts, and let him build a case with the weight of the whole valley behind it, instead of one ranch's word against a banker's. Hannah's eyes moved around the room, steady and certain. Individually, none of us can prove much. Together we have a pattern too large for any territorial court to dismiss. The room was quiet for a moment. The weight of what she was proposing settling over the gathered ranchers, and then Whitfield stepped forward and extended his hand toward her. The same gesture he'd made the day they'd corrected his lease. Count me in, even without a note of my own to worry about. A man who cheats his neighbors ain't a man I care to keep doing business with. Whitfield's jaw was set hard. You've got my paperwork, my word, and whatever else you need from me, Mrs. Mercer. One by one the others followed, the Coltons and the Ashfords, and two more families. Cole barely knew each of them, adding their own piece to the case Hannah was building, and Cole watched his wife stand in the middle of his father's front room, transforming a valley's worth of scattered fear into something that looked for the first time since he could remember like genuine strength. We did it, he said finally, still not quite believing the words as he said them once the last of the ranchers had ridden off into the dark and the house had gone quiet again. We survived it, Hannah corrected. Whether we did it, whether this gamble actually pays off, depends entirely on whether 40 head of Bozeman cattle can hold their own against a Montana winter, and a market that hasn't decided yet whether it's ready to recover. She looked at him, something raw and honest in her expression that she rarely let show. I've never been more frightened in my life than I was signing those papers in Delacroix's office, Cole. I want you to know that. I sounded certain because certainty was the only thing holding either of us together in that moment, but I was terrified the whole time. Didn't look terrified. I've had a great deal of practice not looking things I feel. Something vulnerable crossed her face quick, as it always was gone almost before he could hold on to it. But I meant what I said to Delacroix. I trust this is the way through, even frightened. Especially frightened, maybe. Fear that doesn't move you anywhere isn't worth much in my experience. Cole reached across the space between their horses, and this time he didn't stop short of touching her, closing his hand over hers on the reins, steady and sure in a way that surprised them both. Whatever happens with that herd, you didn't do this alone. Whole Valley wants to make this about your gamble, like I had no say in it. But I signed those papers same as you. I chose this same as you did. Hannah looked down at his hand over hers, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The silence between them, carrying more than any words could have managed. The Valley's still watching, she said, finally quiet. Every rancher who's struggling under a Whitmore note, every family Voss has approached with his buyout offers, they're all watching to see if Silver Creek survives this, because if we do, it proves the fight against Whitmore and Voss is winnable. And if we don't, we will. Cole's voice came out rougher than he intended, fierce, with a certainty he hadn't fully felt until the words left his mouth. 40 head of the finest breeding stock in the territory, a wife smarter than every banker in this county combined, and land 3 generations of Mercers already died fighting for. We didn't come this far to lose now. Hannah's hand turned under his fingers, threading through his own, and though neither of them said anything more for a long moment, the gesture carried its own answer, steady and certain. That night, Cole walked out to the near pasture alone, before turning in, needing to see the herd with his own eyes one more time before he let himself sleep. 40 animals moved in the darkness, shapes he could barely make out against the deeper black of the hills, breathing steady, grazing calm, utterly unaware that their survival through the coming winter would decide whether Silver Creek stood or fell. He stood there a long while listening to them and found himself thinking not about the money or the debt, or even Whitmore and Voss circling somewhere out past the ridge, but about the woman asleep in the house behind him who'd arrived 3 months ago carrying nothing but a single suitcase and a mind sharper than any banker in the territory, and who'd since bet everything she had, everything both of them had on a bloodline of cattle, and her own unshakable conviction that fighting forward beat losing slow. Hannah found him there some while later, a shawl pulled tight against the night air, and she didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, watching the herd, the same way he'd been watching it. "Can't sleep either," Cole said. "No." She was quiet a moment. "I keep running the numbers over and over, even though I know them by heart now. Feed costs through winter, expected calving rates in spring, what the market needs to do for us to come out ahead instead of merely even. I told myself I'd stop once we got the herd home safe, and I haven't stopped at all. Maybe you don't need to stop tonight. Maybe tonight you just look at them a while, same as I'm doing, and let the arithmetic wait till morning." Cole glanced at her in the dark, close enough now that he could see the exhaustion in her face, the toll of 3 months that had asked more of her than most people faced in 3 years. "You did something out there in Bozeman most folks in this valley wouldn't have had the nerve for. Reckon you're allowed one night of just standing here not calculating anything." Hannah looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face softened in a way Cole hadn't seen since the night she'd first told him about her father's shipping business, the old guarded weariness giving way to something gentler. One night, she agreed and leaned almost imperceptibly into the space beside him, and neither of them said anything more. The two of them standing together in the dark, watching over everything they'd risked to save the entire future of Silver Creek, resting for now on whether disease and market and fate would finally break in their favor after a year of breaking against them. Winter came hard that year, same as it always did in Montana. But Cole watched the Delacroix herd shrug off cold that had killed lesser stock in seasons past, thick-coated and steady through blizzards that buried the fence lines waist-deep, and by the time the first calves dropped in early spring, not a single animal from the Bozeman purchase had been lost to weather or sickness. 38 healthy calves out of 40 cows. Amos reported standing in the barn doorway, with snow still melting off his hat, disbelief and pride fighting for space on his weathered face. "Never seen a calving season run that clean, not in 30 years working this land." Hannah was already writing the numbers down before he'd finished the sentence, her pen moving with the same quiet intensity Cole had watched all winter, tracking every birth, every ounce of weight gained, every sign that Delacroix's gamble on disease-resistant bloodlines was paying off exactly the way she'd promised it would. "That's nearly double the survival rate of the general herd this season," she said, looking up with something bright and fierce in her eyes. "Cole, if these calves carry even half their parents' resistance, we're not just recovering from last year. We're building something no other ranch in this territory has." "County's already noticing," Cole said. "Ashford rode by yesterday asking after the bloodline. Wanted to know if we'd consider selling breeding stock once the calves are weaned. Would we?" Figured that decision belonged to both of us. Cole watched her consider it, the same careful calculation crossing her face that he'd come to recognize over 8 months of marriage. Though it moved faster now, sharper, the practiced instincts of a woman who'd learned this land as thoroughly as she'd once learned Chicago ledgers. "We sell selectively," Hannah decided. "Not the whole line, not yet. But if Ashford wants breeding stock, and if the valley's other ranchers start coming around with the same request that's not just income coal, that's the entire valley's herds growing more resistant season after season, which makes every ranch here stronger, including ours. Sounds like more than business to you. It is more than business. Something quieter moved behind her eyes. I spent my whole life being told my worth was decorative coal, something to be admired or dismissed depending on a room's mood. Out here, worth means something I can actually build with my own hands or my own mind and share with people who needed exactly what I had to offer. I don't intend to hoard that, not when sharing it makes the whole valley stronger. Spring brought other news too, carried by a letter from Franklin Reyes that arrived on a clear April morning and changed the shape of everything that had happened over the past year. Hannah read it standing at the kitchen table, and Cole watched her expression shift from careful neutrality to something fierce and satisfied by the time she reached the final page. "They found it," she said, setting the letter down with hands that trembled slightly, though this time from triumph rather than fear. Correspondence between Whitmore and Voss's consortium ceased when the Territorial Banking Commission opened their investigation. Explicit instructions to inflate rates on vulnerable ranches, timed pressure campaigns, even discussion of the blackleg outbreak's origin, which Reyes believes, though, can't fully prove, may have been deliberately introduced through contaminated feed sold to several ranches, including the Coltons. Cole felt something cold move through him at that, a fury that went beyond the money, beyond the ranch, into something that felt like violation. He poisoned the valley's cattle to force ranches into selling. That part remains unproven and likely always will, since the man responsible for procuring that feed disappeared from Cedar Hollow the same week the investigation opened. Hannah's jaw was tight. But the rate manipulation, the coordinated pressure campaign, the collusion with Voss's consortium to consolidate struggling land, all of that is documented now in Whitmore's own handwriting. The Banking Commission has suspended his license pending formal charges. First Montana Trust is being restructured under new management out of Helena, and every rancher in this valley who paid an inflated rate is entitled to restitution. Whitmore's finished, and Voss's consortium has quietly withdrawn every offer they made in this valley, likely because continuing to operate here now would only invite more scrutiny. Hannah looked at him, something like disbelief still coloring her satisfaction. "We did it, Cole. Not just survived it. We actually stopped it for this valley, and likely for whatever territory that consortium tries next, since Reyes intends to make sure this case becomes public enough to warn other banks against trying the same scheme." Cole crossed the kitchen and pulled her into an embrace that had nothing careful or measured about it the first time in their marriage. He'd simply reached for her without weighing the gesture first. And Hannah went still for a moment in surprise before her arms came up around him too, holding on like she'd been waiting a long time for permission to stop being strong for a moment. "You did that," he said into her hair. "Whole valley safe from men who were bleeding it dry because you looked at a bad grazing lease on your first afternoon here and refused to let it go. We did it. I keep telling you that, and you keep forgetting it." But her voice had gone soft, unguarded, in a way Cole rarely heard from her, and he felt her hold on a little tighter before she stepped back, composure sliding back into place like armor she'd only briefly set aside. There's still work ahead. Restitution to collect a valley's worth of ranchers to help navigate new bank arrangements. But for the first time since I stepped off that train, I don't feel like we're fighting uphill anymore. Hollis Pratt cornered Cole outside the Mercantile on a Tuesday, considerably less swaggering than he'd been the year before. "Heard about the bank investigation. Terrible business what Whitmore was doing. Man ought to be ashamed. You called my wife's reckless meddling the reason we were about to lose the ranch Hollis. Same week she was uncovering the scheme that would have cost half this valley their land." Hollis had the grace to look uncomfortable, shifting his weight, unable to hold Cole's eyes for long. "Reckon I spoke too quick on that. Whole town did, probably." "Reckon you did." Cole didn't offer him any easier way out of the conversation, and after a beat of awkward silence, Hollis mumbled something about needing to get back to work and retreated toward the saloon without further comment. Mildred Cotter proved more graceful about it, stopping Hannah outside the church the following Sunday, with an expression that carried genuine, if belated, humility. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Mercer. I said some cruel things when you first arrived, things I'm not proud of now knowing what you've done for this valley since. I appreciate you saying so, Mrs. Cotter. Hannah's tone was gracious, though Cole noticed she didn't quite let the old wound go entirely, some careful distance remaining, even as she accepted the apology. I'd rather be remembered for what I've built here than for what anyone assumed about me on a train platform. You'll be remembered for both, I expect, whether you like it or not. Whole county's talking about the Bozeman cattle, the bank case, all of it. Talking about you like you're the smartest woman ever to set foot in Cedar Hollow. Mildred managed something like a genuine smile. Never thought I'd say that about the woman I once told needed 2 men to help her off a train. By early summer, the valley's other ranchers had begun arriving at Silver Creek with a regularity that transformed Cole and Hannah's kitchen table into something closer to a standing council, families seeking advice on restructured loans, on disease-resistant breeding, on the careful, patient work of rebuilding trust with a banking system that had nearly ruined half of them. Never seen anything like it, Sarah said one evening, watching yet another rancher's wagon roll up the drive. Ranchers who wouldn't give this family the time of day a year back, now driving 2 hours just to ask Mrs. Mercer's opinion on a loan document. She's earned it, Cole said simply, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in his life. Word of Silver Creek's recovery traveled further than Cole expected, and by midsummer, 2 young ranchers rode in from a valley 3 days' travel to the west, having heard secondhand about the Delacroix bloodline and the ledger system Hannah had built to track every dollar and every calf with a precision none of them had ever seen applied to a working ranch. Didn't believe half of what folks were saying. The older of the 2 admitted, standing awkward and hat in hand in the kitchen doorway. A ranch brought back from the edge of foreclosure inside a year, built on numbers instead of luck. Wanted to see it for ourselves, ma'am, and ask if you'd be willing to teach us some of what you know. Hannah looked at Cole for a moment, something bright and startled crossing her face, the particular look of a woman realizing her worth had traveled further than she'd ever imagined it could. I'd be glad to, she said, and spent the better part of 2 days walking the young men through her ledger system, her disease, records, the careful patience that had turned 40 gambled cattle into the foundation of something lasting. Knowledge doesn't multiply by being hoarded, she told them before they rode back west with notebooks full of her methods. It multiplies by being shared, and a valley full of strong ranches protects every single one of them better than one ranch standing alone ever could. Not every consequence of the past year arrived so gently. Late one night in early August, Ricky's shout tore through the yard, and Cole was out of bed and running before he'd fully understood the word he'd heard through the window. Fire, barn's on fire! Cole reached the yard to find flames already climbing the west wall of the barn. Orange light throwing wild shadows across the corral, and Amos and Ricky already hauling water in a desperate, useless-looking bucket line, while the horses screamed and fought their stalls. Get the herd clear first, Hannah shouted, arriving at a dead run in her nightclothes, taking in the scene with the same fast, cold assessment she brought to everything. The barn can burn, Cole, the herd cannot. Amos cut the corral fence if you have to just get them moving away from the smoke. They worked through the better part of an hour in a chaos of heat and smoke and terrified animals, and by the time the flames finally guttered out, half the barn stood scorched and ruined, but the herd stood safe in the far pasture, accounted for unharmed. Wasn't lightning? Amos said grimly, once the danger had passed, crouching beside the scorched foundation with a lantern. Found coal oil residue here along the base. Somebody set this deliberate. Cole felt cold fury replace the last of his adrenaline. Voss? Can't prove it, Hannah said, though her voice carried no real doubt. But it would be a remarkable coincidence, a fire breaking out the same month his consortium's scheme collapsed, and his best chance at this valley disappeared with it. A man like that doesn't walk away from failure quietly, Cole. Sometimes he walks away burning what he couldn't buy. They wrote to Franklin Reyes the next morning, adding the fire to the growing file of evidence against Voss's operation, and though nothing could ever be proven definitively, no further trouble came to Silver Creek in the months that followed, whether from caution on Voss's part or simple retreat. And Cole found some grim satisfaction in believing it was the latter, a man finally understanding he'd picked the wrong ranch to threaten. The Coltons, whose struggling young operation had nearly collapsed under Whitmore's scheme, arrived one afternoon not long after, with news that made Hannah's whole face light with genuine joy for the first time Cole had seen in weeks of steady grinding work. "Restitution came through," Mr. Colton said, still looking faintly stunned by his own good fortune. "Enough to cover what we overpaid plus damages the commission awarded on account of the pressure campaign. We're not just surviving anymore, Mrs. Mercer. We're building same as you." "That's exactly what I hoped to hear." Hannah's smile reached all the way to her eyes, unguarded in a way Cole treasured every time he saw it, still rare enough to feel like a gift. "This valley was never meant to survive on the strength of one ranch alone, Mr. Colton. It survives when every family in it has a fair chance to build something lasting." That evening, after the Coltons had ridden home and the ranch had settled into its familiar quiet, Cole found Hannah on the porch, watching the last light fade over hills that had nearly belonged to a Helena consortium a year before, and something in her posture, easy and unguarded, told him she'd finally let herself rest in the victory, instead of immediately hunting for the next problem to solve. The valley held a harvest gathering that September, the whole county turning out at the Grange Hall, the way it did every year, and Cole watched Hannah move through the crowd with an ease that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. Ranchers who'd once crossed the street to avoid her, now stopping to shake her hand, to ask after the herd, to thank her outright for restitution checks that had arrived in the mail weeks before. Judge Holloway himself sought them out near the refreshment table, a man Cole had rarely heard speak 2 words to anyone outside a courtroom. "Mrs. Mercer, wanted to say personally that the territorial court's grateful for the documentation your case provided. Set a precedent that'll protect ranchers in this valley for a generation, likely longer." "I only did what any reasonable person would face with the same numbers, Judge Holloway. Most folks don't have the nerve to face numbers that plain, ma'am, let alone the sense to act on what they find." The judge tipped his hat and moved on, and Hannah watched him go with an expression Cole recognized now, quiet astonishment at a respect she was still learning how to simply accept rather than brace against. Later, when someone asked Cole loud enough for half the room to hear how Silver Creek had managed to claw its way back from the edge of ruin in barely a year, Cole didn't hesitate over his answer, the way he might have once back when admitting his wife's role still felt like something to soften or share credit for. "Wasn't me that saved it," he said, plain and clear enough that the nearby conversations quieted to listen. "My wife did. Walked off that train with one suitcase and a mind for numbers this whole county underestimated. And inside a year, she found the fraud that was bleeding half this valley dry, gambled everything we had on a bloodline nobody else believed in, and won. She's the reason Silver Creek still exists, and I don't much care who knows it." The room went quiet for a moment, and then Whitfield of all people raised his glass toward them from across the hall, and one by one, other glasses followed a gesture Cole hadn't expected. And Hannah clearly hadn't either, judging by the way her composure finally cracked into something bright and overwhelmed. "You didn't have to say that in front of the whole county," she said later, walking out to the wagon under a sky gone thick with stars. "Wanted to. Been wanting to for months, if I'm honest. Just needed the right room to say it in." Cole helped her up onto the seat, and the drive home passed in a comfortable quiet. Neither of them felt any need to fill. "You've built something here," he said, settling beside her. "More than a ranch. Whole valley looks to you now, same way they used to look to my father, only different. He built respect through 30 years of hard work. You built it in under a year through nothing but refusing to let anyone tell you what you were worth. I had help." Hannah leaned into him, a small, natural gesture that had become easy between them somewhere over the past months without either of them quite marking when it happened. A husband who stood in front of a whole town on a train platform and told them to leave me be before he had any reason to believe I was worth defending. Had every reason. Just took me a few hours to see it clear. Cole pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, something that would have felt impossibly forward 8 months earlier, and now felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Whole county's going to spend years catching up to what I understood about you inside that first week. Let them catch up slowly. I've stopped needing their approval to know what I'm worth." Hannah tilted her face up to his, something warm and certain in her expression that had nothing guarded left in it at all. "I only ever needed one person to see it clearly, Cole. Turns out I got considerably luckier than that. Reckon we both did." Cole kissed her, then unhurried, the kind of kiss that came from months of hard-won trust, rather than sudden passion, and when they finally broke apart, Hannah rested her forehead against his with a small, contented laugh that Cole felt more than heard. "My father would be insufferable about this, you know," she said. "He always did believe he'd made the smartest deal of his career sending me out here. Smartest deal in Montana, too, way I see it." Cole's arms tightened around her, the ranch quiet around them, the herd settling for the night in the near pasture, the whole valley finally at peace after a year that had asked everything of both of them, and given back in the end considerably more than either had dared to hope for. "Silver Creek's still standing stronger than it's ever been, and it's standing because of you. Whole county can argue about who did the figuring, who found the bloodline, who stood up to Whitmore first. Only truth that matters to me is that I married a stranger to save a ranch, and somewhere along the way, without either of us quite planning it, I fell in love with the woman that stranger turned out to be." Hannah went still against him, something raw moving across her face in the fading light. 8 months of careful composure finally giving way entirely. "I love you too, Cole Mercer. I don't think I let myself believe it until just now, saying it out loud. But I have for longer than I've been willing to admit." They sat together on the porch as full dark settled over Silver Creek, the ranch quiet and whole around them. A valley's worth of gratitude gathering slowly at their door, and a future ahead of them that neither cruel gossip nor a corrupt banker nor a consortium's greed had managed to take away, built instead on exactly what Hannah had promised that first afternoon, sitting down at a desk full of tangled ledgers and asking quietly to see the books. Hannah told him about the baby 3 weeks later, standing in the same kitchen where she'd once spread his father's ledgers across the desk, her hands folded over her stomach with a carefulness Cole had never seen in her before, not even facing down Whitmore or signing away every dollar they had in Delacroix's office. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything," she said, watching his face for a reaction she seemed almost afraid to see. "Doc Ellery confirmed it yesterday. Come spring, Cole, there'll be 3 of us at this table instead of 2. Cole crossed the kitchen faster than he'd moved in months, and the sound that came out of him when he pulled her close was half laugh, half something rougher, something that had been building in his chest since the moment she'd first stepped off that train. "A baby," he said, like the word itself might crack if he said it too loud. "Silver Creek's going to have a Mercer in the cradle again. Assuming I don't work myself into an early grave running ledgers and calving records right up until the moment it happens." Hannah's laugh came out, shaky joy and terror tangled together, the way Cole was learning they often were for her, the woman who faced down bankers without flinching, finding this particular kind of vulnerability far harder to hold steady. "I don't know the first thing about being a mother, Cole. I know cattle bloodlines and interest rates, and how to read a fraudulent contract at a glance. I don't know how to raise a child. Neither did my mother first time she held me, I'd wager. Nobody knows how till they're doing it." Cole pressed his forehead to hers, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "Reckon you'll learn the same way you learned everything else out here. Fast and better than anybody expected." The child came in April, a girl they named Eleanor after Hannah's mother, and Cole held his daughter in the same kitchen where his own life had cracked open 18 months earlier, reading a will that had once felt like a sentence, and now felt looking down at Eleanor's small, furious face, like the finest inheritance his father could have possibly arranged. "She's got your stubbornness already," Sarah observed, watching the infant refuse to settle, no matter how Hannah rocked her. "Screaming like she's got opinions on the whole arrangement." "She'll need it," Hannah said, exhausted and radiant, in a way Cole had never seen her, growing up as the daughter of the woman this valley once called useless. "Growing up as the daughter of the woman who saved this valley," Cole corrected, and Hannah's smile tired, as it was reached all the way to her eyes. The years that followed moved faster than either of them expected, the particular blur of seasons that comes with building something real, and Silver Creek grew alongside their family in ways that would have seemed impossible standing on that depot platform 3 years earlier. The Delacroix bloodline expanded steadily, disease-resistant cattle commanding premium prices at markets as far as Helena and Bozeman. And by the time Eleanor was old enough to toddle after the ranch hands, calling questions, In a voice as direct as her mother's, Silver Creek's breeding program had become the valley's chief export, more valuable than any single herd had ever been under Cole's father. A second child came 2 years after the first, a boy they named Ezra, after Hannah's own father. And Cole found himself standing in the same spot by the corral, where Amos had once looked at his new bride with open skepticism, now watching his son take his first unsteady steps toward the fence line, while ranch hands who'd once snickered at Hannah's arrival called out encouragement like doting uncles. Not every season brought only good fortune. 4 years into their marriage, a drought settled over the valley that stretched 3 months longer than anyone could remember. Creeks running to mud pasture, grass browning under a sun that refused to relent. And Cole watched the old fear creep back into some of the neighboring ranchers' faces. The particular dread of watching a hard-won recovery threatened by something no lawsuit or ledger could fix. "We've weathered worse," Hannah said, though even she looked drawn and tired, studying the water report spread across the kitchen table that had seen every crisis of their marriage laid out across it at one point or another. "But if this doesn't break by August, we're looking at supplementing feed for the whole herd, and that's an expense that'll test even our reserves." "What do we do?" "What we always do." Hannah's jaw set with the same determination Cole had watched carry them through Whitmore, through Voss, through a fire that had nearly taken the barn. "We plan for the worst while working for the best. I've already written to Delacroix about drought-resistant grazing methods he's tested in dry seasons. And I think it's time Silver Creek and the rest of this valley invested in a proper irrigation system off the creek, something that survives a dry year instead of praying one doesn't come." The irrigation project took the better part of 2 years, and every ounce of the cooperative goodwill Hannah had spent since the day she'd first gathered the valley's struggling ranchers around Silver Creek's kitchen table. But by the time it was finished, Cedar Hollow's ranches ran on a shared water system that made the whole valley more resilient than any single drought could threaten. Again, a solution Hannah had engineered with the same patient, collaborative thoroughness she brought to everything. "You could have built this just for us," Cole said, watching the irrigation channels carry water to Silver Creek's pastures alongside 3 neighboring ranches. "Kept the advantage to ourselves." "An advantage that leaves your neighbors drowning doesn't stay an advantage for long, Cole. A valley of failed ranches around us doesn't help Silver Creek, no matter how well we've built our own water system." Hannah watched the water move with quiet satisfaction. "I learned that lesson the hard way watching Whitmore try to profit off other people's ruin. I have no interest in becoming a kinder version of the same mistake." Word of Silver Creek's methods. The disease-resistant breeding, the cooperative irrigation, the meticulous financial systems that had turned a nearly bankrupt ranch into the valley's anchor began traveling further than Cedar Hollow, further even than the territory. And by the time Eleanor was old enough to help her mother with the ledgers, a genuine curiosity letter started arriving from agricultural offices in Helena. Then from further still university men in Bozeman, wanting to study the Delacroix bloodline's resistance patterns. Territorial officials wanting to document the irrigation cooperative as a model for other struggling valleys. "They want to send someone out to study the operation," Hannah said one evening, reading a letter from the Territorial Agricultural Board with an expression caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. "A formal survey, Cole. They're calling Silver Creek a model operation. County called you useless 3 years back. County's slow to admit when it's wrong. We've discussed this." But Hannah's eyes were bright, and Cole recognized the particular satisfaction of a woman who'd spent her whole life being underestimated, finally watching the world catch up to what she'd always known about herself. The survey came, and then more visitors followed, ranchers from valleys 2 and 3 days' ride away, arriving to study Hannah's ledger system. Her disease records, the careful documentation that turned instinct into repeatable method, and Silver Creek's kitchen table, the same one where Hannah had once spread Cole's father's tangled papers on her very first afternoon in Montana, became something like an informal school, ranchers and their wives sitting around it long into the evening asking questions. Hannah answered with the same patient thoroughness she'd once brought to a decade-old grazing lease. 6 years after Hannah stepped off that train, Franklin Reyes wrote with news that closed the last open wound from that terrible first year. Elias Whitmore had been formally convicted of banking fraud and rate manipulation, sentenced to a term in territorial prison. First Montana Trust dissolved entirely and its assets absorbed into an honest institution out of Helena. Garrett Voss's consortium, its Montana operations already crumbling under the weight of Reyes's documented case, had quietly folded its interests in the territory altogether. The man himself last reported operating in a different territory, entirely presumably running the same scheme on ranchers who hadn't yet learned to compare their notes against their neighbors. "It's over," Hannah said, setting the letter down at the same kitchen table where the whole fight had begun. Eleanor doing her sums at one end of the table, and Ezra chasing a barn cat under Cole's boots at the other. Truly over Cole. No appeal, no consortium waiting in the wings. The men who tried to destroy this valley are finished, and the valley they tried to destroy is stronger than it's ever been. Took 6 years. Took exactly as long as it needed to take. Some fights aren't won in a single season, no matter how badly you want them to be. Hannah looked around the kitchen at their children, at the ledgers that no longer told stories of debt and desperation, but of steady, patient growth, at the husband who'd stood on a depot platform 8 years earlier and told a whole county to leave his stranger of a bride alone. "I've stopped minding that it took this long. Some things are worth the whole fight start to finish." Ricky, the boy who'd once snorted with laughter watching Hannah dismount that first day at the corral, left Silver Creek in his mid-20s to start his own small operation 2 valleys over. And when he rode back for a visit some years later, he brought his own new bride with him. A quiet, capable woman from a ranching family up near the Canadian line, and something in the careful, respectful way he introduced her told Cole everything about the lessons the boy had carried away from watching Hannah work all those years. "Learned plenty here I never expected to," Ricky admitted, sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd once teased Hannah about giving Whitmore a fright. "Used to think a woman's place on a ranch was in the kitchen, nowhere near the ledgers or the cattle. Watched you prove that wrong near every day for 4 years, Mrs. Mercer. My wife keeps our books now, same as you keep yours. Best decision I ever made letting her. That's the finest compliment anyone's paid me in a long while, Ricky." Hannah's smile carried genuine warmth for the boy who'd grown under her example into a man who judged people by what they built, rather than how they looked doing it. "I hope your operation thrives. Lord knows you learned from good enough teachers out here between Amos and everything Silver Creek put you through. Learned the most from watching this county eat its own words about you, ma'am. Don't reckon I'll forget that lesson, not for the rest of my life." Ricky's wife squeezed his hand, and Cole caught Hannah's eye across the table, both of them recognizing without needing to say it aloud. Another small piece of the world reshaped by a single afternoon on a depot platform 9 years earlier. By the time Eleanor turned 12, old enough to ride the fence line alongside Amos's own grandchildren, Silver Creek Ranch had become something Cole's father, laying that desperate marriage contract in a lawyer's hands, with his last strength, could never have imagined the largest, most respected breeding operation in the territory. Its cattle commanding prices that made Cole's old $2,000 debt look almost quaint by comparison. Its irrigation cooperative studied and copied across 3 counties. Its founder, a woman whose name was spoken in Cedar Hollow, now with nothing but respect. Government agricultural officials made the trip from Helena twice a year to document the breeding program's continued success. University researchers from as far as Missoula came to study disease resistance patterns that had by then spread through half the cattle herds in western Montana. Every rancher who'd bought Delacroix bloodline stock from Silver Creek, contributing to a resilience that had reshaped how the whole territory thought about breeding. Young Mrs. Ashford's asking whether her daughter might come learn the ledger system this summer. Hannah mentioned one evening, sorting through a stack of correspondence that had grown considerably since those early letters to Franklin Reyes and a French cattle breeder outside Bozeman. Says the girl's got a head for numbers nobody in that family knows what to do with. Same as somebody else I know once upon a time. Something like that. Hannah's smile carried an old familiar warmth. I told her to send the girl out whenever she's ready. Seems only right passing it forward. Word of Silver Creek's success, and the woman behind it, traveled in directions Cole hadn't fully anticipated either beyond ranching circles entirely. A newspaper out of Helena ran a feature on the Valley's recovery from what the article called one of the most brazen banking frauds in territorial history, and Hannah's role in uncovering it and rebuilding not just her own ranch, but an entire community's fortunes, earned her a kind of quiet fame that reached young women in towns Cole had never heard of. Girls who wrote letters asking how a woman built a life like that, how she'd learned to read a ledger, how she'd found the nerve to stand up to a banker twice her age in his own office. The reporter who'd written the piece, a sharp young woman herself, had ridden out to Silver Creek for 2 full days before writing a word following Hannah through calving records and irrigation meetings, and a hard negotiation with a Bozeman buyer, and the article that resulted spent as many column inches describing Hannah's methods as it did the scandal that had nearly destroyed her. Mrs. Mercer does not run a ranch the way this territory has come to expect. The piece read in a line Hannah kept clipped and pinned above the kitchen desk for years afterward. She runs it the way a general commands a campaign, with patience, precision, and an unwillingness to lose. I don't know what to tell them, Hannah admitted one night, a stack of such letters spread across the desk, her expression torn between flattered and overwhelmed. I didn't set out to become someone girls write letters to Cole. I set out to save a ranch. Maybe that's exactly why they're writing. Cole picked up one of the letters, read the careful, hopeful handwriting of a girl somewhere in the eastern part of the territory, asking whether a woman really could run a business as well as any man. You didn't try to be an example. You just refused to let anybody tell you what you were worth and did the work anyway. Reckon that's the only kind of example worth following. Hannah answered every letter personally, in the same careful, precise hand she used for ledgers, and Cole watched his wife build without ever quite intending to something larger than Silver Creek Ranch, a quiet reminder scattered across the territory that a woman's worth had nothing to do with what a train platform full of strangers decided about her the moment she stepped off a rail car. The final debt payment on Cole's father's original loan, the very note that had started everything, came due and was settled in full during Eleanor's 15th summer, nearly a decade after Cole had first read his father's will, standing in the barn doorway with his knuckles split and bleeding. Cole rode into Helena himself to close the account, since the bank that had absorbed First Montana Trust's honest remains kept its main office there now, and the manager who processed the final payment shook his hand with genuine warmth. Cole had never once received from Elias Whitmore in all their years of dealing. "Mercer," the man said, checking the ledger twice like he wanted to be certain of what he was seeing. "This closes out the last of it. Silver Creek's debt-free clear as territorial law allows." Cole rode home that evening with a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt since before his father died, and he found Hannah out by the north pasture, where 3 generations of Mercers, and now the beginning of a 4th, lay buried beneath the Montana sky, tending the small garden of wildflowers she'd planted there years earlier, without ever quite explaining why, though Cole had always understood it as her own quiet way of honoring a man she'd never met, but owed everything to. "It's paid," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Every dollar. Debt's gone, Hannah. Ranch is ours outright. First time in 30 years it hasn't owed a cent to any bank in this territory." Hannah straightened slowly, and something moved across her face that Cole had rarely seen in all their years together. A kind of profound, quiet stillness, like she was finally setting down a weight she'd carried since the moment she'd first opened his father's ledgers. "Your father would be proud," she said. "Whatever fear drove him to that marriage contract, whatever desperation made him gamble his son's whole future on a stranger from Chicago, I hope he knows it worked. I hope wherever he is, he knows Silver Creek is safe. He knows." Cole looked out over the graves, over the hills beyond them, thick with cattle that traced their bloodline back to a desperate gamble in Delacroix's Bozeman Corral, over a valley that had rebuilt itself on the strength of one woman's refusal to accept what everyone told her she was worth. Man who wrote that contract was gambling on more than just a marriage, Hannah. He was gambling that whoever Ezra Brooks sent would be exactly the kind of person this land needed. Turned out, he gambled right. They stood together at the graves a long while, the late afternoon light turning gold across pastures that stretched further now than they had in Cole's Father's Day cattle, grazing in numbers that would have seemed impossible to the man who'd once owed $2,000 he couldn't pay. And when they finally turned back toward the house, Eleanor was waiting on the porch with a letter in her hand, her face bright with the particular excitement of a 15-year-old delivering important news. "It's from the Territorial Agricultural Society," she called out, waving the envelope. "They want to name Silver Creek's breeding program after Mama, some kind of honor for advancing disease-resistant cattle across the whole territory. Says you're the most important agricultural innovator west of the Mississippi, Mama." That's what it says, word for word. Hannah took the letter with hands that had gone momentarily unsteady, reading it twice the way she'd once read Whitmore's Fraudulent Breakdown, though this time her expression carried nothing but astonished, overwhelmed joy. "Cole," her voice came out barely above a whisper. "They want to name it after me." "Course they do." Cole pulled her close, Eleanor and Ezra drawn by the commotion, gathering around them on the porch in the fading light. "County spent 3 years calling you useless before they figured out what you actually were. Reckon it's only fair the whole territory takes a turn catching up." That evening, with the whole family gathered on the porch, where Cole had once told Hannah he loved her for the first time, watching a Montana sunset spill gold and rose across hills, thick with the finest cattle in the territory. Cole found himself thinking back the way he sometimes still did to a depot platform 9 years earlier. A crowd of cruel strangers waiting to laugh at a woman they'd already decided was worthless, and a single sentence that had changed the entire shape of his life before he'd even fully understood what was happening. "Show me your ledgers first," she'd said, before she'd even asked where she'd sleep, and Cole understood now, watching his children chase fireflies across a pasture that had nearly belonged to a Helena consortium, that those 5 words had been the truest promise anyone had ever made him. Truer than any marriage vow spoken later in a church that had once mocked her because they'd told him exactly who Hannah Brooks was before he'd had any reason yet to believe it, a woman who looked at broken things and saw not ruin, but work waiting to be done. "Everyone thought they sent me the wrong bride," Cole said quietly, watching Eleanor scoop up a jar of fireflies with the same fierce concentration her mother brought to a ledger. Whole county was certain of it, certain enough to stand on that platform and laugh. "And now?" Hannah asked, though her voice carried no real question in it, only the particular warmth of a woman who already knew his answer. "Now I know God sent me the only partner who could have saved everything. Not despite what this county said about you. Because of everything you actually were underneath what they refused to see." Cole took her hand, weathered now from 9 years of ledgers and cattle, and a fight neither of them had ever fought alone. "Silver Creek's the wealthiest ranch in this territory, Hannah. Whole Valley's stronger for what you built here. But none of that's the thing I'm proudest of watching you tonight." "What is then?" "That a girl somewhere in the eastern part of this territory is going to read one of your letters and believe for the first time in her life that she's allowed to be more than what a room full of strangers decides about her." Cole brought her hand to his lips, the gesture as natural now as it had once been impossible. "That's the part of this that outlasts even the cattle, Hannah. That's the part that's going to matter long after we're both buried out there next to my father." Hannah's eyes were bright in the fading light, and she leaned into him the way she had 1,000 times since that first night watching the herd together, uncertain and frightened, and choosing always to stand her ground anyway. "No one builds something this big alone," she said softly, watching their children's laughter carry across the pasture, watching cattle graze on land that had nearly been lost to men who'd believed a struggling ranch and a mocked bride were easy prey. "Not the ranch, not the valley, not whatever it is those girls see in my letters. I had a husband who believed me before the evidence caught up, a foreman who trusted a strange woman to know sick cattle from healthy ones, a whole valley willing to stand together once somebody showed them the pattern worth fighting. I built nothing alone, Cole. I simply refused to stop building at all." Cole pulled her closer as the last light faded over Silver Creek Ranch, over hills that 3 generations of Mercers had bled for, and a 4th generation now played across, without a shadow of the debt and desperation that had once threatened to swallow it all. And he understood with the same total certainty he'd felt standing on that depot platform 9 years earlier, that whatever the rest of their lives held, they would face it exactly the way they'd faced everything since the moment Hannah Brooks stepped off that train, together, unshakable, and absolutely certain that true strength had never once been about the shape a person carried through the world, but about the courage, the wisdom, and the unbreakable will they carried inside it. Silver Creek Ranch stood that night as it stands in memory, still the undisputed proof of everything the county had gotten wrong, and everything Hannah Mercer had known about herself all along, that a woman the world called useless had built with nothing but her own mind and her own unshakable resolve the richest and most respected ranch in all of Montana.